Evening settles slowly across the old world. Somewhere, a stone tower leans into the night, its iron crown heavy with memory. The wind glides past forgotten battlements. A candle flickers inside a room once filled with command, now emptied of voices. The soft creak of time passes through these places, where power once breathed and ruled, and where silence now remains. Welcome. You've found your way to a gentle journey through shadows, not the frightening kind, but the thoughtful ones. The kind of stories history whispers when the world has gone quiet. Tonight, we'll walk through the lives of rulers who held immense power and used it in ways that left their nations scarred, reshaped, or silenced. But we won't rush. We'll take each name, each place, with care. Not to sensationalize, but to understand how greatness, when untethered from wisdom, can grow cold. And how the cost of misused power is often carried not by the throne, but by the people below it. We begin here, with quiet footsteps through imperial halls and broken promises, to discover the worst leaders with the greatest power. So, come, let's explore history together. Your love and support truly mean the world to me. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Grab your coffee, and let's get started. The marble floors of Rome once echoed beneath the feet of gods, made mortal or mortals who believed themselves gods. In the year 37 AD, as twilight spread its cool hush over the Tiber River, a boy who had grown up in imperial tents and silent corridors took his place atop the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. He was just 24, young, golden-haired, and adored by the masses. They called him Caligula, Little Boots, a name born in the warmth of campfire affection from soldiers who had once adored him. It was meant to be playful, innocent. It would not stay that way. His birth name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Germanicus, the blood of emperors and conquerors running quiet beneath his skin. Orphaned by betrayal, shaped by fear, and raised in the long shadow of imperial paranoia, Caligula's early years were a delicate balance of privilege and danger. His mother was exiled, his brothers were killed, and yet the young boy survived, watched, learned, waiting for the moment power would fall into his hands. When it did, Rome rejoiced. At first his rule was mild, thoughtful, even. He granted bonuses to soldiers, recalled those wrongfully exiled, and opened his court to the public. Rome exhaled, a new dawn perhaps, a benevolent heir to Augustus and Tiberius. But then, as if overnight, something shifted. The stories speak softly, like shadows behind curtains. A fever, a mysterious illness that nearly claimed his life only months after taking power. He emerged from that illness changed. The light behind his eyes dimmed, and from then on it seemed as if the emperor no longer walked among mortals, but above them, not as a ruler but as a deity. He declared himself a living god. Temples were built in his name. Statues of Jupiter were remade with Caligula's face, golden and eternal. He stood atop balconies and demanded worship, not just loyalty, but reverence. Senators were forced to kneel before him, their eyes lowered as they whispered prayers not to the divine, but to a man. What followed was not merely tyranny, but spectacle. Caligula turned the imperial palace into a stage, and Rome into his audience. He appointed his horse Incitatus as consul, not as a joke, some say, but as a deliberate humiliation of the Senate, a reminder that even an animal could hold more favor than Rome's political elite. He built floating palaces across the Bay of Naples, glittering barges with mosaic floors and colonnades, as if the sea itself were his private villa. Entire fortunes were spent on banquets that lasted for days, where food was gilded and wine flowed like rivers. But beneath the glitter, Rome began to rot. He ordered executions without trial. Senators disappeared, families vanished in the night. He enjoyed watching fear, the way it changed people, made them bend. And behind closed doors, the stories grow darker still. Whispers of cruelty, of sudden rages, of laughter at suffering. Yet even as the emperor burned his name into the marble of Roman life, the people once adoring began to whisper in turn. His madness, they said, had no boundary. no restraint. He had turned the eternal city into a garden of fear. And yet in his own mind, Caligula may not have seen madness. Perhaps he saw clarity, a world too weak, too small to understand the scale of his vision. When he invaded Britain, only to turn back and collect seashells as spoils of war. He saw triumph. When he bankrupted the treasury to build statues of himself, he saw legacy. But power, when stretched too far, begins to tremble. It was in the 4th year of his reign that the tremble became a break. On a cold January morning in 41 AD, as he passed through a narrow corridor of the imperial palace, a group of guards once loyal drew their daggers. The attack was swift. Caligula fell, not as a god but as a man bleeding quietly into the marble. He was 28. His body was hurriedly buried beneath cover of darkness, his statues destroyed or hidden, his name condemned in whispers. Rome, shaken but relieved, sought to forget, but history does not forget so easily. Caligula remains one of the most studied, debated, and mythologized rulers in Roman history. To some, he was simply mad. To others, he was the product of a system that devoured itself. A boy raised in the jaws of empire, taught that survival came not through kindness, but spectacle. He was both victim and executioner of a world where power was everything, and humanity was optional. And still, in quiet museums and broken temples, his name lingers. A single coin, a fractured statue, a faded inscription carved into ancient stone. They tell us not just about Caligula, but about the strange gravity of unchecked rule, the way power, when worshipped for its own sake, distorts not only the one who holds it, but all who must live beneath its shadow. And so the chapter closes, not with fire or applause, but with the soft recognition that even the brightest thrones can harbor the darkest echoes. Breathe gently now. The city is quiet again. The wind moves through the old stones, carrying away the last whispers of a ruler who mistook fear for loyalty and silence for worship. Night in ancient Rome carried a certain stillness. Soft winds moved through colonnades, lanterns flickered low across cobbled streets, and the Tiber whispered its slow rhythm beneath the bridges. But on one fateful evening in 64 AD, that silence shattered, not with the cry of war but with the crackle of flames. The Great Fire of Rome would become legend, not just for its destruction, but for the man who reigned when it burned. Nero Claudius Caesar, son of Agrippina, heir to emperors, artist of the stage, his name would one day echo with infamy, but it did not begin that way. His early reign was promising. When Nero became emperor at just 16, many hoped his rule would soften the edges of imperial cruelty. He was a student of poetry, music, and theater, a prince who played the lyre and dreamed not of conquest, but of applause. The Senate welcomed him cautiously. The people embraced him fully. He reduced taxes, outlawed capital punishment, and poured funds into public games. In those first years, Rome bloomed again, not with marble and conquest, but with laughter and celebration. But power rarely sleeps peacefully. Behind Nero's gentle facade were the unseen fingers of his mother, Agrippina, a woman as ambitious as she was cunning. She had paved the way for his ascension, eliminating rivals and weaving alliances. But as Nero matured, he chafed against her grip. Their relationship turned from warmth to tension, and eventually to dread. It's said that Nero orchestrated her death, perhaps by collapsing the ceiling above her bed, or sinking a sabotaged boat beneath her. The stories differ, but the outcome remains. Agrippina was gone, and something inside Nero unraveled with her. Freed from his mother's shadow, Nero began to embrace his own vision of emperorship, one not shaped by duty, but by indulgence. He surrounded himself with actors, musicians, philosophers, and flatterers. He built golden palaces, most famously the Domus Aurea, a sprawling marvel of marble, gardens, and artificial lakes. Rome twisted into his private stage. He sang on rooftops, performed poetry to captive audiences, and forced nobles to attend hours-long recitals. And then the fire came. It began on a warm summer night in July. A small flicker in the merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus. But within hours it grew. Fanned by dry winds, wooden rooftops and market stalls were consumed. Fire leapt from street to street, from district to district. Rome, made largely of timber, ignited like parchment. For 9 days the flames devoured the city. Historians still debate the cause. Was it accident, sabotage, or something more deliberate? In the years that followed, one rumor never faded, that Nero had watched from a safe distance, lyre in hand, singing of Troy's destruction as his city burned. It's a story that clings to his name like ash, more symbolic than proven, but deeply embedded in the memory of Rome. In truth, Nero was not in the city when the fire began, but when he returned, his actions blurred the line between ruler and performer. He opened his gardens to the homeless. He arranged for food supplies and shelters. But then, almost immediately, he began rebuilding. Where old Rome had been narrow, crowded, and humble, the new Rome rose wide, opulent, and shimmering. Fireproof stone replaced wood, streets widened, fountains multiplied, and in the heart of it all, Nero claimed a vast stretch of land for his golden house. A palace so grand it held its own artificial sky. Whispers began again. Had the fire been an opportunity? Had Nero, poet, dreamer, emperor, allowed his city to burn for the sake of creation? The question may never be answered, but the consequences were swift. Needing a scapegoat, Nero turned to a small, misunderstood group, the early Christians. Still few in number, they were viewed with suspicion by traditional Romans. Their customs were unfamiliar. Their refusal to worship Roman gods felt rebellious. Nero accused them of arson, and the punishments were brutal. Many were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific public spectacles. It was cruelty as theater. Even some of his own advisors recoiled. Yet Nero, untethered from restraint, drifted further into delusion. He traveled to Greece and insisted on competing in musical contests. No one dared let him lose. He declared himself the greatest artist in the empire. Statues were erected in his image, not as a statesman, but as a divine performer. Back in Rome, the Senate's patience wore thin. The treasury, drained by Nero's indulgence, strained under new taxes. Discontent bubbled through the provinces, and eventually rebellion rose. In 68 AD, as armies turned against him, and the Senate declared him a public enemy, Nero fled, not to lead, but to hide. He retreated to a villa outside the city, accompanied by a small group of loyal servants. There, with no crown, no applause, and no stage, he faced the truth he had long avoided. In his final hours, Nero is said to have wept not for his empire but for his voice. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered. He died by his own hand. The first Roman emperor to do so, his death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of a troubled new era. Yet Nero's legacy lingers. Some called him mad. Others saw him as misunderstood, a man born to rule but meant to create. His life remains a strange paradox. Cruelty laced with art, tyranny wrapped in beauty. He destroyed but also rebuilt. He silenced, yet sang, and in his wake Rome was forever changed. Tonight, as you drift further into rest, consider this. Great power does not always wear armor. Sometimes it wears silk robes, speaks in poems, and builds golden halls, not for the people but for the mirror. And sometimes fire is not just a tragedy, but an artist's canvas. Breathe in, let it go. Rome has quieted once again. The smoke has lifted. The lyre is silent, and the night moves forward. Snow fell like breath across the Russian plain. It did not howl or rage. It simply settled, covering rooftops, trees, and forgotten battlegrounds in a blanket of stillness. Beneath that endless white sky stood the spires of Moscow, tall, colored, watching, while inside the great stone walls of the Kremlin, a boy grew into a name the world would never forget. Ivan the later known as Ivan the Terrible. But before the world feared him, the child was simply a prince, small, observant, and utterly alone. He was just 3 years old when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died from a sudden illness. And though young Ivan inherited the title of Grand Prince of Moscow, it was little more than a shadow. Power passed, not to the boy but to warring nobles, the boyars, who ruled in his name while treating him more as a symbol than a soul. Within the Kremlin his life was cold, both in stone and in spirit. He watched his mother, Elena, try to protect him, and then saw her poisoned before his eyes. After her death, the boyars fought one another for influence, using Ivan like a pawn on a frost-bitten board. He was often left in rags, hungry, ignored. Servants beat him. Guards mocked him. And as the winters passed, something inside him began to harden. He read obsessively, especially about rulers and saints. He studied history, law, and war. And he waited. He would later write that, as a child, he would take cats and dogs to the Kremlin rooftops and throw them to their deaths, not out of cruelty, but out of powerlessness. The cold indifference of his guardians taught him that compassion had no place in court. So when he came of age, he did not ask for the throne. He claimed it. At 16, Ivan declared himself Tsar of all Rus, not just prince, not merely ruler, but Caesar. It was a word meant to echo Rome, to invoke divine rule. It was the first time any ruler of Russia had done so. The boy was gone. In his place stood a monarch, crowned not just by tradition, but by divine right. At first there was hope. He revised the legal code. He promoted merit over birth. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle noblewoman known for her kindness and intelligence. With her by his side, Ivan was more balanced, even visionary. He founded the Streltsy, Russia's first professional standing army, and expanded education, infrastructure, and law. But then came war. Ivan sought to expand Russia's borders, to reach the Baltic Sea and open trade routes to the west. The Livonian War began in 1558 and would stretch on for decades. The toll was heavy. Villages burned, fortresses fell, soldiers starved, and as the war dragged on, Ivan's trust in his advisors began to fray. And then Anastasia died, poisoned, perhaps, or simply ill. But for Ivan, her death was the final splinter in an already fragile heart. The grief broke him. The Tsar, who had once spoken of justice and unity, became consumed by suspicion. He blamed the boyars. He blamed everyone. What followed was the rise of a new terror, the oprichnina. Ivan divided his realm into two parts, the traditional Russian state and a second, darker realm, directly under his rule. This second realm was enforced by the oprichniki, black-clad riders on black horses, their saddles adorned with dog heads and brooms, to sniff out treason and sweep it away. They acted with absolute authority. They tortured, they executed, they confiscated land and silenced voices. The countryside, once merely cold, became a theater of fear. In the city of Novgorod, wrongly suspected of treason, thousands were massacred in a brutal purge. The river Volkhov turned red, choked with bodies. Entire families disappeared. And still, Ivan ruled. There were moments, even amid the terror, when he wrote letters filled with scripture and sorrow. He seemed to see himself not just as a tyrant, but as a kind of holy instrument, a punishing hand shaped by divine will. He fasted, prayed, and repented, before ordering new executions the next day. His contradictions were as vast as the land he ruled. He corresponded with foreign rulers in elaborate, often hostile letters. One to Queen Elizabeth I of England swings between respectful diplomacy and sharp condemnation. He invited architects to Russia, then blinded the ones who built St. Basil's Cathedral, legend says, so that its beauty could never be repeated. And as the years passed, the storm of his mind deepened. His own family did not escape. One evening, in a rage over what he saw as inappropriate dress from his pregnant daughter-in-law, Ivan struck her. She miscarried. When his son, also named Ivan, confronted him, the Tsar lashed out again, this time with a blow to the head. His heir collapsed. He died days later. There is a painting, famous, haunting, of Ivan the Terrible cradling his son's body, his eyes wide with horror. Whether the remorse was real or imagined, the legacy could not be undone. The heir to the Russian throne was dead. The dynasty would begin to collapse not long after. When Ivan died in 1584, Russia did not breathe easily. It slipped instead into what would become known as the Time of Troubles, a period of famine, rebellion, and foreign invasion. His rule had centralized power, but at the cost of humanity. He had built an empire through fear, not unity, through death, not destiny. And yet for all his cruelty, Ivan left a lasting mark. He expanded Russia's borders. He established symbols and structures of tsardom that would echo for centuries. He saw Russia not as a collection of fiefdoms, but as a single divine empire, vast, frozen, and eternal. But perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is how close he came to being something else. Had Anastasia lived, had grief not taken root, perhaps Ivan would be remembered as a reformer, a unifier, a czar who turned Russia from medieval state to modern power. But grief, when paired with unchecked authority, becomes a kind of frost, slow, creeping, and fatal. And so history remembers him, not as Ivan the Great, but as Ivan the Terrible. Tonight, as the snow settles again over the Russian steppe, and the wind whispers softly through the onion domes of St. Basil's, we let the silence return. The oprichniki are gone. The throne is cold, and the boy who once stared out at the world from the dark corners of the Kremlin is finally at rest. Steel, smoke, and silence. This was the scent of Soviet power. Not the kind built on the spirit of revolution, but the kind engineered in factories, stitched into uniforms, and written in the ink of fearful reports. In the heart of the 20th century, where history moved with the noise of trains and the tremble of tanks, one man turned a young revolution into a machine, precise, brutal, and deeply cold. His name was Joseph Stalin, born Iosif Jukashvili, in the rough Georgian town of Gori. The child who would one day rule the largest country on earth began life in shadows. His father, a shoemaker, drank often and struck hard. His mother, deeply religious, dreamed of her son joining the priesthood, but the boy, sharp-eyed and quiet, had already begun to dream of something else. His early years passed through seminaries and narrow streets, filled with books and secrets. By his late teens he had discovered Marxist literature, writings that spoke of class struggle, of workers rising, of empires crumbling. These ideas lit a fire within him that religion never had. He turned from faith to revolution, from God to Lenin. He joined underground circles, wrote under the name Koba, and moved through the early Soviet movement like a ghost, organizing strikes, printing papers, robbing banks to fund the cause. Arrested, exiled, and arrested again, Stalin survived not through charisma but through calculation. When the 1917 revolution finally came, sweeping the Romanovs into history, Stalin was not yet a central figure. He did not lead from the podium. He did not stir crowds, but he was always present, watching, noting, wait, and then Lenin died. The founder of the Soviet state left behind a power vacuum. Others were louder: Trotsky, Zinoviev, Bukharin. But Stalin was more patient. He held a key position, General Secretary of the Communist Party. It sounded dull, bureaucratic, but it gave him control over appointments, over who rose and who fell. Quietly, methodically, he outmaneuvered them all. By the late 1920s, Stalin stood alone. And once he held power, he began to reshape the Soviet Union in his image. First came the 5-year plans, ambitious, forceful, and unrelenting. Agriculture was collectivized, farms were merged, and peasants forced into communal labor. Those who resisted, labeled kulaks or wealthy peasants, were exiled or executed. Millions starved as quotas rose and grain was shipped to cities or sold abroad. Ukraine in particular suffered deeply. The Holodomor, as it came to be known, took millions of lives through state-enforced famine. Factories rose like monuments. The Soviet Union industrialized at breathtaking speed, but at a staggering cost. Workers toiled in dangerous conditions. Deadlines became commands. Failure was treason. And yet, the machine kept turning. Beneath the roar of industry, a darker silence spread. The silence of fear. Stalin, deeply distrustful, began to see enemies everywhere. In 1934, the assassination of party official Sergei Kirov became a spark. The Great Purge followed, a sweeping campaign of terror aimed at eliminating traitors. Party officials, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were arrested, tortured, and executed. Confessions were extracted through brutality. Trials were staged for public consumption. Names vanished from photographs. Entire families disappeared in the night. The gulags, vast prison camps across Siberia and beyond, filled with those deemed disloyal. Millions were sent away, often for the smallest offense. A joke, a letter, a foreign book. Trust broke apart. Neighbors watched. Neighbors. Children feared parents. The sound of footsteps outside a door at night became for many the most terrifying noise imaginable. And still, Stalin ruled. He crafted an image of himself as the father of the nation. A kindly, pipe-smoking leader, wise and firm. His portraits hung in every school, every office, every home. His name became sacred. To doubt him was to doubt the revolution. And yet, outside the Soviet borders, the world was shifting. In 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler's Germany. The two great ideologies, communism and fascism, shook hands in cold strategy. They divided Poland between them. But the alliance was temporary. In 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The war that followed was unlike any the nation had faced. Entire cities were razed. Millions died in battle, in occupation, in siege. Leningrad starved for nearly 900 days. Stalingrad burned and bled, its streets becoming altars to resistance. The Soviet people, hardened by years of suffering, fought with fierce resolve. Stalin, now a wartime leader, adapted. He loosened his grip on some parts of society. He revived the Russian Orthodox Church to inspire unity. He appeared more publicly, gave speeches, invoked patriotism. The Red Army, battered and brutal, slowly pushed back. And when Berlin finally fell in 1945, Stalin emerged not just as a survivor, but as a victor. He had defeated Hitler. He had expanded Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. The world, once skeptical, now saw him as a necessary force in global politics. But victory did not soften him. After the war, the Iron Curtain descended. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, not just politically, but culturally and ideologically. Stalin tightened his grip once more. New purges began. New labor camps filled. Science, art, and philosophy were bent to the will of the state. And behind closed doors he aged suspicious, reclusive, ill. He feared doctors, feared betrayal. In his final days, he lay in his dacha outside Moscow, surrounded not by warmth or comfort, but by silence. His aides, too afraid to enter, waited hours before checking on him. By the time they did, the stroke had done its work. He died in 1953, not from an assassin's blade or foreign plot, but from the isolation he had spent decades cultivating. Joseph Stalin remains one of history's most polarizing figures. To some, he was the savior of the Soviet Union, the man who turned a fractured land into a superpower. To others, he was a tyrant, responsible for the deaths of millions, for the crushing of thought, and for building a system where fear became the currency of rule. But beyond titles, beyond statistics, there lingers a deeper sadness. A revolution that had once promised liberation became, under Stalin, a machine, and a machine, no matter how powerful, cannot love. It cannot feel. It simply moves forward, crushing whatever lies beneath its wheels. Tonight, let the factories fall silent. Let the reports be folded, and let the wind carry the last whispers of the man who turned a dream into steel and steel into silence. beneath the thick canopy of the Central African rainforest, where rivers cut through green like silver veins and the air hums with the weight of heat and time. A different kind of empire once took root, not born from within, but imposed from afar. In this place of ancient trees and living silence, history remembers a darkness not written in centuries past, but in a time alarmingly near. It was called the Congo Free State. But it was neither free nor a true state. And at its center sat a king who never once stepped foot on its soil. Leopold II of Belgium. He wore his beard long and sharp, like the statues he would later commission in his own honor. A monarch of a small European nation, Leopold harbored ambitions far greater than his borders. Belgium, in the late 19th century, was a young country, industrious, neutral and compact. But Leopold dreamed of something more, an empire. Not in Europe, but in the distant jungles of Africa. When European powers gathered in Berlin in 1884 to divide the continent among themselves, a meeting now infamous as the Scramble for Africa, Leopold presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian. He claimed he would bring civilization, Christianity and commerce to the dark continent. He spoke of protecting Africans from the slave trade, of uplifting the native population. It was a mask, a lie, draped in the language of virtue. With the stroke of international agreements and careful diplomacy, Leopold gained control of a vast territory, larger than all of Western Europe combined. He named it the Congo Free State. But it was his entirely, not Belgium's, not the government's, his personal possession. From his royal palaces in Brussels, he ruled a land he would never visit, and what followed was one of the most brutal regimes the modern world has ever seen. The Congo, rich in ivory and rubber, became a source of unimaginable wealth. The Industrial Revolution had created a hunger for rubber, for tires, cables, hoses, and in Leopold's Congo, this demand was met through forced labor. Entire villages were ordered to meet rubber quotas, often impossible ones. Those who failed were beaten, mutilated, or killed. Hands were cut off as punishment, or as proof that bullets had not been wasted. The forests became traps. The rivers ran with silence, and deep within, a million cries went unheard. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 10 to 15 million Congolese died during Leopold's rule, from starvation, overwork, disease, or violence. Entire communities vanished, languages were lost. The land bore the scars not only of whips and chains but of memory itself. And yet, in Belgium, the king was celebrated. He commissioned grand buildings, wide boulevards, and monuments that glittered with colonial pride. He became one of the richest men in Europe, not through war or nobility, but through the quiet, distant suffering of a people whose names he never learned. He adorned Brussels with architecture funded by Congolese blood. And in public, he maintained the fiction that his mission was one of kindness, of progress, of civilization. But truth, even when buried, has roots. A small but determined group of missionaries, travelers and humanitarians began to tell another story. One man, E.D. Morel, noticed something strange in shipping records. Goods flowed from Congo to Belgium, ivory, rubber, timber, but what returned were only weapons and chains. There was no trade, only extraction, only control. Morel and others began to speak out. Photographs emerged, images of children with severed hands, of villages burned, of men with haunted eyes. Public opinion began to shift. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle joined the outcry. The Congo Reform Association was formed, and gradually the international community could no longer look away. Under mounting pressure, and with his reputation unraveling, Leopold was forced to relinquish the Congo Free State in 1908. Control was handed over to the Belgian government. But even then, much of the system remained. The exploitation continued, less openly, but still deeply rooted. Leopold, however, kept his fortune. He died the following year. When news of his death reached Brussels, a crowd gathered outside the palace. They jeered. And yet, his statues remained. Even now, across Belgian cities, Leopold's likeness stands tall, bronze and stone, gazing down from horseback or throne. For years his crimes were softened in textbooks, spoken of with diplomatic caution. It is only in recent decades that a fuller picture has emerged, a reckoning, slow and incomplete. In the Congo, the legacy is not just historical. It lives in memory, in the shape of borders, in the echo of lost generations. A nation whose wealth was stolen before it could even understand its worth. And what of the king? Leopold II, despite his carefully composed image, ruled not through vision or wisdom, but through distance. His genius was not in governance, but in deception. He understood how to speak one language to diplomats and another to his agents on the ground. He perfected the art of hiding cruelty beneath the veil of purpose. He wore white gloves, while others carried the whip. Tonight, we remember not the marble, not the gold, but the silence of the trees, the forests that bore witness. The river Congo, still winding through its basin, knows more than history can say. And as night settles over its waters, the jungle rests again. It has outlived the king. Let your breath soften now. Let your thoughts slow. The statues may still stand, but their stories can be reclaimed, not with anger, but with understanding. Not with noise, but with quiet truth. The shadow of the Congo is long, but even shadows fade when gently brought into the light. Beyond the northernmost mountains of the Korean peninsula, where the forests grow still and thick beneath pale snow, a strange silence settles, not the peace of untouched land, but the silence of control. It is a silence enforced through decades of song, statue, and fear, a silence written not by the people, but for them. At the center of this quiet stands a figure preserved in bronze, in portraits, in legend: Kim Il-sung, the eternal president of North Korea. He was born in 1912 under a sky darkened by empire. Korea, at the time, was under Japanese occupation. The land, its language, and its people were being reshaped by colonial force. And in this climate of resistance and erasure, a child named Kim Song-ju came into the world. The name Il-sung would come later, a title as much as an identity, meaning become the sun. As a young man, he joined the anti-Japanese resistance. He fought in the forests of Manchuria, moving with guerrilla fighters, sometimes surviving more on belief than on food. He learned how power operates from the margins, not through speeches, but through whispers and retreat. The Soviets noticed him. He rose in rank, not just through charisma, but through usefulness. By the end of World War II, Japan had surrendered, and Korea stood divided. The Soviet Union in the north, the United States in the south. Two ideologies, two patrons, and soon, two countries. From this fracture, Kim Il-sung was chosen, first by Moscow, then by circumstance, to lead the new northern state. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded in 1948, but democracy, here, would live only in name. From the beginning, Kim ruled with certainty. He suppressed rivals, reshaped the party around his image, and began to build a myth. He was not merely a revolutionary, but a liberator. Not simply a man, but the destined father of a pure Korean future. The press, the radio, the classrooms all echoed with a single message. Kim Il-sung is the heart of the nation. But it was in 1950 that the dream of unification through force ignited. North Korean troops, under Kim's command, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. What began as a regional gamble spiraled into international war. The Korean War drew in China, the United States, and the United Nations. Cities were razed, mountains were bombed, millions died. When the war ended in 1953 with an armistice, no victory, no peace, the peninsula remained divided. A thin strip of land, the demilitarized zone, marked not just a border, but a wound. And in the north, Kim Il-sung turned inward. He emerged from the war, not humbled, but hardened. He began crafting a self-reliant ideology, Juche, blending socialism with intense nationalism and isolation. It taught that the Korean people, under his guidance, needed no one, no outside influence, no foreign models, only the leadership of the great leader. Statues began to rise, thousands of them. In every town, in every school, in every home. His image appeared. His words became scripture. Children recited his sayings. Adults bowed before his portraits. To question him, even in private, was treason. But behind this curtain of loyalty, the machinery of surveillance grew. The Boebu, North Korea's secret police, infiltrated every part of society. Informants were everywhere. Families were punished not just for their own descent, but for the sins of relatives. Sometimes generations passed. It was a system not of justice, but of memory, long, cruel, and inescapable. And yet even as the borders closed, Kim Il-sung opened wide his stage. He welcomed visits from leaders who would accept the performance, from China, from the Eastern Bloc, from sympathetic countries abroad. He wore tailored suits, spoke with confidence, and hosted grand parades. Visitors saw wide boulevards, clean buildings, organized crowds, but they did not see the shortages, the forced labor, in the countryside. The policies of collectivization pushed farmers into hardship. Harvests were over-reported to meet impossible quotas. Famine loomed, then struck. But numbers in North Korea were secrets. The suffering remained undocumented, unspoken. Inside Pyongyang, the capital became a carefully constructed theater. Every tree was planted to line a site. Every apartment was built to gaze upon a statue. Entire families were relocated to create the illusion of uniformity. Citizens were assigned positions within a social caste system known as songbun, where loyalty to the regime determined access to food, education, and safety. But no matter the hardship, the myth endured. Kim Il-sung was not simply obeyed, he was mourned in advance. State media described his childhood in glowing tones, stories of heroic feats, of wisdom beyond his years, of supernatural endurance. His biography blurred into legend, retold so often that truth no longer mattered, only belief. And in the early 1970s, he prepared something unprecedented, a dynasty. Communism, by its nature, rejected monarchy. But Kim, in a move that startled even his allies, began grooming his son Kim Jong-il. As successor, portraits of the younger Kim slowly appeared. Loyalty songs were rewritten to include him. The ideology of the state was adjusted. Power now was not just institutional, it was familial. By the time Kim Il-sung died in 1994, he had ruled North Korea for nearly 5 decades. But even in death, he did not vanish. The government declared him eternal president. His body was embalmed and placed in the Kumsasan Palace of the Sun, where he lies to this day under dim lights and marble ceilings. Citizens are required to bow before his preserved figure, not as a memory, but as a presence. Kim Il-sung's legacy is complex, but coldly clear. He built a nation, not on prosperity, but on control. Not on connection, but on isolation. His was a reign of image, where the greatest power was not military, but psychological. A world in which the sun never set, because the lights were always kept on. His portraits still hang. His words still shape policy. His statues still stand, larger than life. But somewhere beyond the border, just past the barbed wire and still fields, the real world waits, with its contradictions, its chaos, and its quiet, unshaped truth. Tonight, that truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be remembered. As you drift now, imagine the wind blowing gently across the mountains of the north, snow falling on silent train tracks, the sound of no applause, just the hush of a country paused beneath the weight of one man's name. Sleep softly. The broadcast has ended. The loudspeakers are still. The hills of northern Spain are ancient, lined with olive trees and wild poppies. Shepherds still guide their flocks there, as they have for centuries, and in the soft golden light of late afternoon, the land breathes slowly, as if recalling a long memory. But beneath this peace, Spain once held its breath for nearly 4 decades, caught in the tight grasp of a man who promised unity, but delivered silence. His name was Francisco Franco. He was born in 1892 in the coastal city of Ferrol, to a family steeped in naval tradition. As a child, he rarely laughed. Reserved, formal, focused, he attended military school young and graduated quickly. Where others chased glory in war, Franco built a reputation for discipline, endurance, and precision. He was not flamboyant, he did not inspire adoration, but he was trusted, steady, silent, sharp, and that was how he rose. By the 1920s, Spain was a monarchy in crisis. The tides of modernity pulled against an older order, and the waves of ideology, socialism, anarchism, nationalism, crashed hard. A republic emerged, then a fragile democracy, and as cracks deepened, Franco waited. The turning point came in that year. The Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties, won Spain's elections. Land reform, workers' rights, secular education. These were promises of change, but for many conservative generals, landowners, and monarchists, it felt like revolution. The military coup that followed was not clean. It fractured the country in two. Thus began the Spanish Civil War, a brutal, intimate conflict that tore villages, families, and identities apart. On one side, the Republicans, socialists, communists, liberals, and anarchists. On the other, the nationalists, monarchists, conservatives, the church, and Franco, who would become their leader. The war lasted 3 years. Bombs fell on civilian towns. Prisoners were executed in churches and cellars. Foreign powers joined from afar. Hitler and Mussolini supporting Franco, Stalin backing the Republicans. It was not just a war over borders, but over ideas. Guernica, a quiet Basque town, was bombed into rubble by German planes in 1937. The world looked on in horror. Picasso painted his famous mural in response, a swirl of anguish and shadow. But Franco did not flinch. He advanced steadily, not quickly, but with cold, patient force. By 1939, the Republicans were defeated. Spain had fallen into his hands. Franco did not declare himself a king, nor a president. He called himself simply El Caudillo, the leader. His rule would last until his death in 1975. In those years, Spain changed. But it changed only as Franco allowed it to. He banned all political parties except his own. Trade unions were crushed. Regional languages, Catalan, Basque, Galician, were forbidden in public life. Books were censored. Songs disappeared. Even children's names were regulated to ensure they reflected Catholic tradition. He restored the power of the Church, binding religion tightly to the state. Catholicism became not just spiritual but political. Schools taught obedience. Teachers were watched. Dissent meant prison, or worse. Tens of thousands were executed or imprisoned in the years following the war. The graves of many still remain unmarked, scattered in forests and fields. Families whispered their grief, careful never to speak too loud. And yet, Franco insisted on peace. He presented himself not as a dictator, but as a father. He wore military uniforms, but rarely raised his voice. His image was everywhere, solemn, unchanging, often surrounded by flags. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and tradition. But beneath the surface, a darker stability prevailed, the kind that does not tolerate movement. Economically, Spain remained isolated for years. While Europe rebuilt after World War II, Spain lagged behind, self-contained, closed off. Poverty persisted. Emigration swelled. For many Spaniards, especially in rural regions, time seemed to stop. But time, even when denied, finds its cracks. By the 1950s and 60s, Franco began to open doors carefully. Tourism was allowed, drawing foreign currency. Foreign businesses were invited in. A middle class slowly emerged. But political reform remained frozen. Franco's control was total and personal. He handpicked his inner circle. He vetted even the smallest decisions. Ministers, journalists, educators, all served at his pleasure. Television was state-run. News came only from approved sources. Opposition was not debated, but erased. And still, the silence grew. It seeped into lullabies, into prayers, into the quiet glances between neighbors. Entire generations grew up knowing how to smile without revealing their thoughts. In Catalonia and the Basque Country, identity was preserved in secret, through whispered poems, through private letters, through the passing down of names that no longer appeared in public. The land remembered, even when the maps didn't. Franco never apologized. He rarely explained. To him, Spain was not a republic of voices, but a single melody, and he was the conductor. In his final years, illness crept in. The man who had ruled for nearly 4 decades grew frail, but never released control. He refused to dismantle the system he had built. Instead, he appointed a successor, King Juan Carlos I, a monarch meant to preserve the dictatorship. But history, as it so often does, chose differently. Franco died in 1975. His funeral was grand, his body buried in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, a monumental site built in part by the labor of political prisoners. He was laid to rest beneath a giant cross, watched over by silence. And yet, when Juan Carlos took power, he did not continue the dictatorship. He guided Spain toward democracy. The transition was not without difficulty. But it came. Elections returned. Parties re-emerged. The voices long suppressed began to speak again, and the silence broke. Today, Spain still wrestles with the memory of Franco. His statues have been removed, his remains exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen, and yet the wounds of his era, some deep, some hidden, remain part of the landscape. History does not always heal neatly. But tonight, as we step back from the echo of those long years, the streets of Madrid sleep beneath warm light. In Barcelona, children speak Catalan freely. In Bilbao, songs once banned now play in public squares. The silence has been lifted. But we remember it, not to reopen it, but to understand what it cost. Rest easy now. The flags no longer wave in unison. The old anthem has faded, and the bells toll once more for many, not just one. Dawn breaks gently over the plains of Cambodia, a country of lotus ponds and quiet paddies, where water buffalo stir in the mist and palm trees cast long shadows across endless fields. But just beneath the surface of this tranquil land lies a history marked by silence of a far different kind. A silence born not of peace, but of erasure. Here, between 1975 and 1979, an entire country was emptied by one man's vision. His name was Saloth Shah. The world remembers him as Pol Pot. Born in 1925 into a relatively comfortable family, Pol Pot's early life was calm and unremarkable. He studied in Phnom Penh and later received a scholarship to Paris. There, surrounded by the charged debates of post-war Europe, he was introduced to Marxist theory, writings of revolution, class struggle, and historical transformation. But where others saw reform, Pol Pot saw purity, a return, not to the future, but to a mythic past. When he returned to Cambodia, the kingdom was still under French colonial influence. The monarchy, the clergy, the cities, all to his mind, were tainted by foreign thought and capitalist decay. He joined a growing communist movement and retreated into the jungle. Years of clandestine organizing, alliances, and rural support followed. Then came the war. As the Vietnam War spilled across borders, Cambodia found itself caught between forces far larger than itself. The U.S. launched a massive bombing campaign on Cambodian territory to target Viet Cong sanctuaries. The country destabilized. A civil war ignited. The cities teemed with refugees. Chaos bred opportunity. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot's revolutionary army, captured Phnom Penh. The city cheered. They believed the war had ended, that peace had arrived. They were wrong. Within hours, The soldiers began ordering everyone to leave, not just government officials, not just the wealthy, everyone. The sick, the elderly, children in hospital beds. The entire population of the capital was forced into the countryside. Phnom Penh, a city of over 2 million, was emptied in days. No explanation, no expectation. It was the beginning of year zero. Pol Pot believed that Cambodia, or Democratic Kampuchea, as he renamed it, must be cleansed of modernity. His goal was to create a pure, agrarian society, a nation of farmers. He rejected money, religion, education, cities. Everything associated with the past was to be discarded. Society was to begin again, from scratch. Those who resisted were erased. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, anyone with soft hands, foreign knowledge, or the wrong expression was marked. Glasses became a death sentence. A second language could mean torture. Monks were defrocked or killed. Libraries burned. Currency was abolished. The markets closed, the calendar reset. The countryside was divided into labor camps. Families were separated. Children raised by the state. From dawn to dusk, people worked the fields under the eye of armed guards. Food was scarce. Meals consisted of watery rice porridge. If anything at all, disease spread. Exhaustion set in. And still the people dug. The soil of Cambodia, rich and red, began to cover the unspoken. Those accused of disloyalty, sometimes for as little as a sigh, were taken away. 2 prisons. The most infamous of these was Tuol Sleng, or S, a former high school in Phnom Penh. It was converted into a place of systematic torture. Within its grey walls, thousands passed through, but fewer than a dozen survived. Prisoners were forced to sign confessions of imagined crimes, conspiring with the CIA, collaborating with the Vietnamese, dreaming of rebellion. These confessions were used to justify their execution. And outside the cities, in secret groves and remote fields, the ground began to fill with bodies. The Khmer Rouge called them killing fields. Often, bullets were considered too expensive. Victims were beaten to death with farm tools, bamboo sticks, even palm tree fronds sharpened to blades. Babies were murdered beside their mothers, and always, the sound of propaganda music played over loudspeakers to muffle the screams. It is estimated that nearly 2 million people, a quarter of Cambodia's population, died during Pol Pot's rule. Not in battle, but through starvation, forced labor, torture, and execution. And yet, Pol Pot rarely appeared in public. He remained a shadow. His voice heard only through radio broadcasts. His image rarely seen. He referred to himself not as a ruler but as brother number one. Even within the Khmer Rouge, he ruled through secrecy. Decisions were made behind layers of bureaucracy and coded language. Orders came unsigned. Blame was diffused. In this way, he preserved an illusion that violence came from necessity, not design. By the late 1970s, paranoia consumed the regime. Purges extended even to Khmer Rouge officials. Trust collapsed. Factions turned against one another. And beyond the eastern border, Vietnam watched. In 1979, following border clashes and the mass killing of ethnic Vietnamese inside Cambodia, the Vietnamese army invaded. The Khmer Rouge collapsed quickly. Pol Pot fled west into the jungle, where he remained for nearly 2 decades, protected by loyalists, still clinging to the idea of return. He never stood trial. He never offered confession. In 1997, the remnants of the Khmer Rouge placed him under house arrest. A year later, he died quietly in his sleep. His body, hastily cremated in the jungle, was placed on a bed of tires and burned with a bottle of old petrol. No ceremony, no judgment, only smoke. And yet, the land remembers. Today, the killing fields have become places of mourning. Tuol Sleng is now a museum, filled with photographs of the condemned, each face a story interrupted. Skulls are stacked behind glass. Mass graves are marked by simple signs, and everywhere there is the sound of wind passing over grass. It is not history written in books, but in silence. Pol Pot did not possess the grandeur of other tyrants. He built no monuments, founded no dynasty, left no towering architecture behind. His power came not from charisma or military might, but from the terrifying simplicity of his belief that perfection required destruction, that a nation could be purified through fire. But the truth is simpler still. You cannot build paradise on the bones of your people. Tonight, as the moon rises over the rice paddies and the frogs begin their ancient chorus, Cambodia breathes again. Its scars are deep, but healing. Its people still speak in gentle tones, and beneath the stars the fields have begun to grow once more. Let your breath slow now. Let memory drift like mist over water. The dictator is gone, but the names of the lost are still whispered by the wind. Beneath the 7 hills of Rome, where the marble temples cast their long shadows over ancient stone, and the Tiber winds like a lazy serpent through the heart of empire, the name of one emperor still stirs unease. Not for what he built, but for what he allowed to burn. Nero. He ruled not at the twilight of Rome, but in its golden afternoon, a time when the empire stretched wide and heavy with wealth, culture, and ambition. And yet, beneath the gilded ceilings and perfumed baths, something more fragile lingered, a city packed too tightly, a senate restless, and a boy who wore the crown too soon. Nero was born in 37 AD, the great-great-grandson of Augustus, and adopted by Emperor Claudius. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was among the most formidable women in Roman history, calculating, patient, and fiercely ambitious. It was she who positioned Nero as heir, edging out Claudius's biological son. When Claudius died, likely poisoned, Nero became emperor at just 16. At first he was guided. Seneca, the philosopher, whispered wisdom. Burrus, a trusted general, provided discipline, and for a few short years, Rome breathed easier. Taxes were eased, games flourished. The young emperor presented himself as cultured, poetic, even generous, but the balance would not hold. Ambition ripened into paranoia. Influence grew heavy, and Nero, drawn not to governance but to art, began to shed his counselors one by one. Seneca was dismissed, Burrus died, and Agrippina, once the force behind the throne, became a threat to it. Her murder, ordered by Nero, was clumsy, almost theatrical. A failed attempt at sea, then poison, finally, the blade. The details blurred by time, but the silence that followed was unmistakable. Rome had watched a son kill his mother, and still, the city stood. Nero, now unchallenged, turned inward. He fancied himself not a ruler, but a performer. He played the lyre. He sang poetry. He acted on stage, scandalous for an emperor. Senators sat stiff in crowded theaters, clapping until their palms ached, afraid to look away. But Rome was more than performance. It was fragile, wooden, ancient. Its streets were narrow, its homes built tightly, many of them of timber and packed reed. And in the summer of 64 AD, the winds turned hot and dry. The fire began near the Circus Maximus. It spread fast, carried by wind and panic. For 6 days Rome burned, a roar of flame and ash that consumed temples, neighborhoods, and marketplaces. When it seemed to ebb, it surged again. Of the city's 14 districts, 10 were damaged, 3 were almost completely destroyed. The people searched for someone to blame. Rumors swirled. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered of sabotage. And then, inevitably, the name emerged: Nero. He was said to have watched the city burn from his palace on the Palatine Hill. Some claimed he wept. Others said he played the lyre, singing of the fall of Troy, comparing Rome's destruction to mythic grandeur. Whether these stories were true hardly mattered. The damage was done. Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small, unfamiliar sect, the Christians. They were easy targets, foreign, secretive, reluctant to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson, and the punishment that followed was savage. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in public spectacles. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were coated in pitch, mounted on poles, and burned alive as torches to light Nero's gardens. The crowds watched. The city mourned. But the terror had been redirected. With much of Rome in ruin, Nero saw opportunity. He launched a massive rebuilding project, widening the streets and regulating construction materials. But most famously, he began construction of a new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Sprawling across the heart of the city, it featured fountains, artificial lakes, and rooms covered in gold leaf and precious stones. Its ceilings rotated like the heavens. Perfumed water flowed through the halls. The Colossus of Nero, a giant bronze statue, stood at the entrance, watching over what had once been a crowded neighborhood. To many Romans, this was the final insult. Their homes burned, and in their place, a playground for one man's ego. Discontent grew. The Senate whispered. Governors in distant provinces stirred. Revolts broke out, and in 68 AD, the army finally turned. Nero, abandoned by allies and declared a public enemy by the Senate, fled Rome. He hid in a villa outside the city, unable to find a friend willing to offer refuge. As soldiers closed in, he prepared to end his life, but could not bring himself to strike the final blow. A freedman, Epaphroditus, helped him do it. His final words, as recorded by the historian Suetonius, were soft, qualis artifex, perio. What an artist dies in me. Nero was 30 years old. He left behind no children, no successor, only echoes of fire, of song, of shadow. The Golden House was stripped and buried. The Colossus was moved and later repurposed, and yet his name lingered, both cursed and curiously admired. Later emperors sought to distance themselves. Christians came to see him as a symbol of persecution. Artists saw in him a warning of ego unbound. And history, ever layered, remembers him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. For Nero did not conquer vast lands. He did not craft great laws. But he did something perhaps more terrifying. He ruled an empire while playing pretend. And when Rome needed an emperor, it got instead a boy with a stage. Tonight, as the embers of memory cool and the soft hush of midnight settles, the old stones of Rome rest, some still scorched, some still silent. The city lives on, its streets rebuilt, its arches standing. But if you listen closely near the Palatine Hill, you might still hear the quiet rustle of a vanished curtain. Let your breath deepen. Let the flames fade into soft ash. The theater is empty now, and the echoes of the lyre no longer linger. In the long, bitter winters of Russia, where the rivers freeze like sheets of glass and the forests echo with the soft howl of wolves, power has often come with a cold, solemn face. But none perhaps colder, nor more haunted, than that of Ivan V, the man history would name Grozny. In Russian, Grozny does not quite mean terrible. It means something heavier, formidable, fearsome, or inspiring. But over time, the terrible part remained, because Ivan was not simply a ruler. He was a storm in human form, brilliant, brutal, and utterly alone. He was born in 1530, into a land stitched together by fragile threads. Russia, or Muscovy as it was then known, was a realm of warring princes, a land of snowbound cities and wooden churches crowned with smoke. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena, ruled as regent until she too died suddenly, likely poisoned. And so the boy Tsar came of age in a court ruled by ambition and fear. Noble families, the boyars, vied for control. Ivan watched them whisper, plot, and punish. He witnessed beatings, murders, and betrayals. Power, to him, was always a cruel thing, a thing to be seized and never trusted. At age 16, he demanded something no Russian ruler had before: to be crowned Tsar of all Russes. It was more than a title. Tsar came from Caesar, the divine ruler. the heir to Rome and Byzantium. In that moment, Ivan declared himself not a prince among princes, but an emperor above all. He was now not only sovereign of Russia, but ordained by God, and at first he ruled well. He reformed laws, limited the corruption of local governors, and promoted education. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a noblewoman of calm presence and deep faith. With her, Ivan softened. For a time, he seemed to seek harmony, but fate would not let him rest. In 1560, Anastasia died, likely poisoned, like so many others close to him. Ivan was shattered. He believed the boyars had taken her from him, that their ambition had crept even into his bedchamber. And from that grief, a new Ivan emerged, colder, crueler, afraid of everything, and capable of anything. He withdrew from court life. Then suddenly he returned, not to plead but to threaten. In 1565 he created a private domain within Russia, the Oprichnina. It was a state within the state, ruled by Ivan alone. He surrounded himself with the Oprichniki, a black-clad secret police force mounted on dark horses, bearing the symbol of a dog's head and a broom. The dog to sniff out treason, the broom to sweep it away. They rode through villages, monasteries, and cities, executing those who displeased the Tsar, confiscating land, burning homes. Thousands were tortured. Entire noble families vanished. The countryside, once dotted with farmsteads, fell into silence. Ivan watched from a distance, writing long, furious letters to foreign rulers and church leaders. He claimed righteousness. He accused others of betrayal, but beneath his words was something deeper. The echo of a child once helpless, now lashing at ghosts. His violence grew not just toward enemies, but toward his own people. In 1570, suspecting treason in the city of Novgorod, Ivan led a personal campaign of terror. The gates were sealed. The citizens, men, women, even children, were regged to the frozen Volkhov River, bound, stabbed, or drowned beneath the ice. Monasteries were looted. Priests murdered. It is said that for weeks the river turned red. And yet, Ivan prayed. He gave to the church. He fasted. His faith never wavered. Only his mercy. Diplomatically, Russia suffered. Wars against Sweden and Poland dragged on. Trade routes collapsed. Famine spread. The Oprichnina, far from securing loyalty, had shattered the land. And in his palace, Ivan grew increasingly isolated. He filled his halls with foreign alchemists and jesters. He corresponded with Queen Elizabeth I of England, at one point proposing marriage. She declined. He scolded her in return, accusing her of pride and disloyalty. He married multiple times. Some wives died mysteriously. Others were sent to convents. Each union failed to give him peace. His sons became pawns in his endless game of succession. Paranoia followed every step. Then, one day in 1581, the unthinkable happened. Ivan, in a fit of rage, struck his son, Ivan Ivanovich, on the head with a staff. The blow was fatal. The young Tsarevich died days later, cradled by his grieving father. A painting by Repin, centuries later, would capture that moment, the wild eyes of a killer, the limp body of a son. It was the moment. Ivan broke. He had destroyed his own future. He lived a few more years, haunted, hollow. His power, once immense, now flickered. In 1584, Ivan died while playing chess. Some said it was poison, others simply the toll of a life ruled by ghosts. He was buried in the Kremlin, but the Russia he left behind was wounded. His surviving son, Fyodor, was weak and incapable of rule. His death led to a dynastic crisis, and within years, Russia plunged into what would be known as the Time of Troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. The crown he forged, so heavy, so bright, had become a weight no one could carry. Today, Ivan the Terrible remains a complicated shadow in Russian memory. To some, he is remembered as a strong ruler, who defended Russia's borders. To others, he is a tyrant, unpredictable, blood-soaked and cruel. Statues of him have been debated. Songs, stories, and plays continue to reinterpret his life. Even now, his bones are questioned, exhumed, studied, and returned. But one thing remains clear. He ruled, not with reason, but with fear. Not with justice, but with vengeance. And though he sought to make Russia great, he left it broken, trembling beneath snow and silence. Tonight, imagine the frozen steppe, stretching endlessly beneath the stars, the creak of old churches, the soft toll of bells. A lonely man in a fur-lined robe, standing at a frost-covered window, watching a land that feared him more than it loved him. Let the snow fall gently now. Let the echoes rest. The Tsar is gone. Only winter remains. There is a peculiar silence in the Albanian countryside, not the silence of nature, but of something left behind. Across hills and fields, on beaches and in forests, strange concrete domes sit scattered like forgotten sentinels, small, round, and hollow-eyed. They watch over a country that once looked inward for safety and outward with suspicion. These are the bunkers of Albania, over 70,000 of them, and their story is the story of Enver Hoxha, a man who ruled for over 4 decades by cultivating isolation, fear, and an enduring belief that the world was never far from betrayal. He was born in 1908 in the Ottoman town of Gjirokastër, a place of cobblestone alleys, steep hills, and watchful balconies. The son of a cloth merchant, Hoxha was raised in a world of changing empires and vanishing borders. Albania had only recently declared independence when he was a boy, but the fragile new nation was quickly overwhelmed by foreign influence. Italians, Germans, Greeks, Serbs, all casting long shadows. Hoxha studied briefly in France and Belgium, absorbing Marxist literature, then returned home just as the winds of fascism began sweeping across Europe. During World War II, Albania became a battleground. The Italians invaded, followed by the Germans. Resistance movements sprouted across the hills: royalists, nationalists, communists. Among them, Hoxha emerged as a cautious but capable organizer. He was not flamboyant. He did not inspire with fire or fury. But he knew how to build loyalty through fear, precision, and control. By 1944, with Nazi forces retreating and the monarchy in disarray, Enver Hoxha and his Communist Party seized power. He would never let it go. From the beginning, Hoxha tasked Albania as a fortress. First, he aligned with Yugoslavia, ruled then by Marshal Tito. But when suspicion brewed, fears of Yugoslav dominance, Hoxha cut ties. Next, he turned to Stalin's Soviet Union, praising its model of strict communism. But when Khrushchev took power and began to reform, Hoxha denounced him too. He called it revisionism. He called it betrayal. Eventually, even China, Albania's last major ally, was deemed untrustworthy. And so by the 1970s, Hoxha led the most isolated country in Europe. No alliances, no aid, no imports, no dissent. Albania had become a self-made island. He built a system where loyalty to the state replaced every other connection. Religion was banned outright. Churches, mosques, and monasteries were closed or destroyed. Albania declared itself the world's first officially atheist state. Wearing a cross or reading a Quran became grounds for imprisonment. Or worse, families were watched. Neighbors listened. Children were encouraged to report on parents. The Sigurimi, Hoxha's secret police, ensured no whispers of rebellion grew into action. Informants lived in every building, sat in every meeting. Trust dissolved into performance, and the bunkers rose. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Hoxha ordered the construction of concrete fortifications, tens of thousands, from the smallest village to the highest mountain. Engineers objected. Military officials hesitated. But Hoxha insisted. He believed Albania could be invaded at any moment by NATO, by Yugoslavia, by enemies from within. Each bunker was cast with thick concrete, reinforced with steel. meant to withstand assault. Some were small, meant for a single soldier with a rifle. Others were vast underground networks, stocked with weapons and supplies. But none were ever used in war. They became symbols instead, of paranoia cast in stone, of a country forced into stillness. Economically, the consequences were severe. With borders closed and trade restricted, shortages became routine. Food was rationed. Electricity unreliable. Foreign books were banned. Music from outside the Iron Curtain was silenced. Even contact with foreign tourists, on the rare occasions they were allowed, was limited and watched. In the cities, statues of Hoxie loomed large. Portraits of him hung in every classroom, factory, and village hall. He wrote books. He gave speeches. He denounced enemies real and imagined. And all the while he aged slowly, carefully, surrounded by a shrinking circle of trusted officials. He believed he was preserving Albania, saving it from corruption, preserving its purity. But what he truly built was a vault, one that locked the country away from the world. There were no public executions in grand squares, no fiery speeches promising empire. Instead, Hoxha's terror came in the form of quiet disappearances, anonymous denunciations, trials held behind closed doors. Those accused of treason, sometimes for owning a foreign magazine, sometimes for praising Beethoven, were imprisoned in remote labor camps. Families were branded kulaks, or enemies of the people, exiled to remote villages where survival was slow and humiliating. Over time, even the Communist Party began to eat itself. Hoxha's own allies were purged. One by one, his most loyal comrades were accused of deviation, of weakness, of Western thought. He ruled with the loneliness of a man who trusted no one, and perhaps understood no one. By the early 1980s, Albania was frozen. Its streets were gray, its youth restless, but its dictator remained. Enver Hoxha died in 1985, quietly, at age 76. His funeral was somber, orchestrated, filled with slogans of unity and strength, but the cracks were already forming. Within a few years, communism would collapse across Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall would fall. The Soviet Union would vanish. And Albania, long cut off from the world, would be forced to open its eyes. The years that followed were difficult. With Hoxha's economic model shattered and institutions hollowed, the country descended into unrest. The 1990s saw mass protests, political violence, the collapse of financial systems, and waves of emigration. A nation once trapped behind walls now flooded outward, toward Italy, Greece, Germany, anywhere that promised work, food, and freedom. And still, the bunkers remained. Too many to destroy, too solid to repurpose. Some became shops. Some were turned into cafes, museums, or storage rooms, but most simply stood, weathered by time and rain, unmoving. Today, Albania is a nation reconnected. Its cities are vibrant, its borders open. Its people, especially the young, look outward, toward possibility, not paranoia. But the legacy of Enver Hoxha lingers, in the stories whispered by grandparents, in the abandoned prisons hidden in forests, in the quiet caution that still shapes public speech, and in the bunkers, small, gray, countless, dotting the land like punctuation marks on a long, unfinished sentence. Tonight, as the stars drift over Tirana, and the soft coastal winds roll in from the Adriatic, let your breath follow the quiet of the hills. The concrete domes do not speak anymore. The dictator is gone. The walls have cracked. The silence is softer now. Let the weight lift. The doors are open. The fortress has fallen, and the world has returned. In the dense green jungles of Central Africa, where the Congo River curls through ancient lands and whispers of colonial scars still linger in the underbrush, one man draped himself in power as if it were a costume, sewn from myths, stitched with gold, and spotted like a leopard. His name was Joseph Désiré Mobutu. The world came to know him as Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Nbiendu Waza Banga. the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. But the people of Zaire simply called him Mobutu, and for more than 30 years his was the only name that mattered. Born in 1930 in Les Salas, a small Congolese village under Belgian colonial rule, Mobutu's early life was marked by contradiction. He was educated in Catholic mission schools, disciplined in European ways, and drawn to authority. As a young man, he joined the Force Publique, the colonial army, then became a journalist, writing with sharp clarity and quiet ambition. In 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium. The transition was chaotic. Power shifted violently. Patrice Lumumba, the charismatic first prime minister, promised justice and dignity, but the old powers, both foreign and local, were not ready to let go. Within months, the country unraveled. Provinces seceded. The military split. Lumumba was arrested, and in the shadows, Mobutu, once his ally, turned against him. Backed quietly by the West, Mobutu seized control. Lumumba was executed. His body was never found. His voice silenced. And into the void stepped Mobutu, a man with no clear ideology, only the hunger to rule. By 1965, after a second coup, Mobutu declared himself president. He promised to bring order. He vowed to restore pride. But beneath the words, something else stirred, something theatrical, calculating, and deeply personal. He began with identity. The Congo, he declared, would be renamed Zaire, an ancient name drawn from local languages, meant to evoke strength and timelessness. Colonial names were banned. Cities were renamed. People were encouraged, then forced, to adopt African names. Mobutu himself abandoned Joseph and crafted a new identity wrapped in tradition and legend. His image was everywhere. Statues rose in every province. Portraits hung in homes, offices, schools, and shops. He wore a leopard skin hat, carried an ivory-tipped cane, and often appeared in a tailored brown safari suit, a style so consistent it became a symbol. He was photographed descending from airplanes, waving from balconies, surrounded by soldiers in sunglasses. He did not walk. He strode. He did not speak. He proclaimed. His cult of personality was vast, crafted not with brute speed, but with steady, relentless detail. And behind it he ruled like a magician, distracting, disappearing enemies, turning crisis into theater. Mobutu was not a leader of plans, but of presence. He once declared, "There is no state in Zaire, only Mobutu," and for a time, it was true. He centralized all power. He abolished political parties, allowing only one, his own. He handpicked ministers, generals, and governors. He replaced opponents not with trials but with silence. Prison cells deep in the jungle became graveyards for forgotten names. But Mobutu understood something many dictators never did. He made himself useful. To the West during the Cold War, Mobutu was a bulwark against communism. He opened Zaire's resources, copper, diamonds, cobalt, to foreign companies. In return, aid flowed in. American presidents welcomed him. European leaders smiled. Money came, and Mobutu spent it with elegance. He built an airport in his hometown, large enough to land a Concorde. He flew to Paris for shopping trips. He owned mansions in Switzerland, villas on the Riviera, and a palace with air-conditioned stables. Meanwhile, the people of Zaire waited in long lines for bread. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Teachers went unpaid. Roads crumbled into dust. But no one complained, at least, not aloud. Mobutu's Sûreté Nationale, the secret police, were everywhere. Whispers were dangerous. Sarcasm could be fatal. And yet, Mobutu laughed often. He encouraged what he called authenticity, a return to traditional values, even as he himself lived in European luxury. He spoke of African dignity, while depositing billions into foreign banks. He staged grand parades and cultural festivals, inviting the world to see Zaire shine. But beneath the gold embroidery was a fragile shell. His regime was built on loyalty bought, not earned. His economy survived on mineral exports and borrowed money. His generals were given riches to keep them quiet. His ministers were shuffled like cards, never allowed to grow too powerful. And always, the people watched. They watched as hospitals closed. While Mobutu's marble palaces gleamed, they watched as their children left for foreign cities, seeking futures not found at home. They watched, until watching turned to waiting. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended. Mobutu was no longer needed. Aid dried up. Criticism sharpened. His health declined. Cancer whispered from within. And in the east of Zaire, rebellion stirred. In 1997, after more than 30 years of rule, Mobutu fled. His army, unpaid and weary, refused to defend him. He boarded a plane with a few loyalists and flew to Morocco. He died later that year in exile, quietly, far from the jungles and palaces of home. His body was never returned to Zaire. His grave was modest. His name, once spoken with reverence and fear, faded into memory. Zaire was renamed again, back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the wounds remained. The economy, hollowed out. The roads, broken. The institutions, brittle. The people, tired. And yet, in marketplaces and old songs, Mobutu's name still echoes, not always with anger, sometimes even with nostalgia. For in the years that followed, chaos returned. New wars came. And to some, even a golden cage seemed safer than an open battlefield. But the leopard hat now rests quietly. The parades have ended. The statues have fallen. And the man who once flew in golden jets now sleeps in silence. Tonight, as the night folds over the Congo River and the trees hush their rustling, let your breath ease into stillness. Let the echoes of velvet rule drift into shadow. Let the gold fade, the drums quiet, the leopard return to the forest. Power is a costume, but the land always remembers. On an island touched by warm breezes and sugarcane fields, where the Caribbean Sea glitters like glass, and the scent of salt and mango hangs in the air, a man once ruled with such vanity, such precision and such cruelty, that even the sky seemed to reflect his image. His name was Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina. To his admirers, he was El Jefe, the boss. To his victims, he was a shadow that swallowed the sun. And for over 3 decades, the Dominican Republic existed, not as a nation of its own will, but as an extension of his, bound by portraits, statues, renamed towns, and a silence as heavy as a storm. He was born in 1891 in San Cristobal, a sleepy town near the southern coast of the island. The Dominican Republic had already weathered political chaos and foreign occupation. Like many of his generation, Trujillo was shaped by disorder, a child of broken institutions, searching for power where it had so often been misused. In 1916, the United States occupied the Dominican Republic, citing regional instability. It was during this time that Trujillo joined the National Guard, a force trained and equipped by American Marines. He rose quickly through the ranks, known for his obedience, his discipline, and his hunger. By 1930, after a military-backed coup and a staged election, Rafael Trujillo became president, and he would remain, in name or in shadow, until his assassination in 1990. He began by consolidating control. Opposition parties were banned. Dissenters disappeared. The press was tamed. And in place of institutions, he built a cult, not of ideas but of self. He renamed the capital Ciudad Trujillo. Mountains, streets, even children were given his name. Schools taught his biography. Churches praised his virtue. Every home was expected to hang his portrait. But it was not enough to be feared. Trujillo demanded admiration. He built grand avenues and whitewashed mansions. He sponsored beauty pageants and parades. He handed out gifts in public, smiling like a father watching over his children. Behind the smile was a web of surveillance. Trujillo's secret police, the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, or SIM, tapped phones, read letters, and eavesdropped on whispers. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Families kept secrets from one another. Even laughter was measured. Those who questioned his authority were often found at night, bruised, silenced, or never found again. But beneath the fear, Trujillo orchestrated a peculiar order. The economy improved. Infrastructure expanded. Schools were built, roads paved, cities modernized. The world, wary of Latin American instability, saw a polished facade. Foreign dignitaries were welcomed with fanfare. American presidents shook his hand. He was not unpredictable like some. He wore suits tailored in Paris. He spoke in polished Spanish. He projected the image of stability, but this too was illusion. Trujillo owned nearly everything: the sugar plantations, the banks, the ports, the newspapers. He controlled wages, trade, and land. His family grew wealthy beyond imagination. He installed relatives in government positions, regardless of competence. The country's prosperity was his, both in credit and in coin. And when resentment stirred, he wielded violence with quiet cruelty. In 1937, one of the darkest chapters unfolded. Concerned about growing Haitian immigration, Trujillo ordered a cleansing along the northwestern border, an operation later known as the Parsley Massacre. Over several days, Dominican soldiers rounded up Haitians and Dominicans who looked or sounded Haitian and executed them, often with machetes to suggest local conflict. To distinguish who was Haitian, soldiers asked people to pronounce the word perejil, parsley, a mispronunciation in French. Creole could mean death. Estimates vary, but between 10,000 and 20,000 people were killed. The massacre was condemned internationally. Trujillo offered reparations, but the silence within his own country deepened. In private, he was meticulous. He kept records of rivals, of conversations, of favors owed and insults remembered. He seduced women across the island, sometimes coercively, often through displays of power. Beauty queens were summoned, actresses invited, sometimes under the pretense of national duty. Even his own family was not spared the web of his dominance. Yet he believed himself chosen. He invoked God, destiny, heritage. He saw enemies everywhere: communists, Haitians, priests, intellectuals, foreign meddlers. He struck back with the patience of a spider. In 1960, after the Organization of American States condemned his regime, Trujillo authorized the attempted assassination of Romulo Betancourt, the president of Venezuela. A car bomb exploded, killing the driver, injuring Betancourt, and bringing Trujillo into national scorn. The balance had shifted. Once seen as a bulwark against chaos, he was now viewed as the chaos itself. Inside the Dominican Republic, resistance had already begun. The Mirabal sisters, known as Las Mariposas, the butterflies, had been speaking against him for years. In November 1960, they were ambushed, beaten, and murdered by Trujillo's agents. Their deaths lit a fuse. The people remembered their courage. Whispers became meetings. Meetings became plans. On May 30, 1961, Trujillo's car was ambushed on a lonely highway. His assassins, some former allies, emptied their weapons into the vehicle. The body of the man who had ruled every inch of the nation was left behind in silence. His son tried to hold power, but the regime fell. The city of Ciudad Trujillo returned to its original name, Santo Domingo. His statues were torn down. His family fled, and for years the Dominican Republic wrestled with the ghost he left behind. Today, Trujillo's legacy remains bitterly debated. Some recall order, roads, clean streets. Others remember fear, blood, and silence. The economy he built was fragile. The control he maintained came at enormous human cost. And yet his portrait still hangs in certain homes, not always proudly, but as a memory of a time when one man seemed to command the wind. In literature, he appears as villain and symbol. In music, as warning. In history, as a figure whose mirror reflected not just himself, but the price of unchecked power. Tonight, let the sea hush the edges of that story. Let the island breeze soften the echoes of his voice. The Mirror Palace stands no longer. The statues have cracked, and the shadows now belong to memory. Breathe deeply. The tide has washed the footsteps away, and the island, once silenced, now sings. Across the plains of Castile, where wheat sways beneath a dry wind and stone churches stand against time, there once walked a man who wore silence like armor. Francisco Franco, the caudillo of Spain, did not rise with fire, nor rule with thunder. His power moved slowly, like the ticking of an old clock, inevitable, restrained, and unrelenting. He was born in 1892, in the coastal city of Ferrol, into a family of naval officers and military tradition. Spain, at the time, was a country adrift. The last remnants of its global empire had slipped away, and a quiet melancholy hung over the land. Pride remained, but the machinery of empire had rusted. The nation was divided between monarchists and republicans, traditionalists and modernists, the church and secularists. Franco chose discipline. He entered the infantry academy at Toledo, where he showed little charisma but clear loyalty. He was small in stature, measured in tone, but unnervingly precise. His gaze, peers would later say, gave little away. In Morocco, as a young officer in the colonial army, he learned the violence of war. He led Spanish forces in brutal campaigns, earning medals and promotion. The desert shaped him, not just through bloodshed, but through control. He developed a philosophy of obedience, tradition, and calculated cruelty. By 33, Franco was the youngest general in Europe. But Spain, meanwhile, was unraveling. The monarchy had fallen. A republic was declared. Radicals pushed for reform, land redistribution, secular education, rights for workers. Conservatives recoiled. Churches were burned. Strikes rippled across cities. And in 1936, a fragile democracy fractured entirely. A group of military officers staged a coup against the left-leaning government. Franco joined them, reluctantly. Some say, quietly. Others say. But once inside the movement, he quickly emerged as its core. What followed was not a quick seizure of power. It was a civil war. Spain descended into 3 years of blood. On one side, the Republicans, workers, anarchists, communists, secularists, students. On the other, the nationalists, monarchists, landowners, church leaders, and the military. Foreign powers flooded in. Hitler sent planes. Mussolini sent troops. The Soviet Union sent advisors. The world watched Spain like a mirror, each side seeing its own future. In 1937, in a small Basque town called Guernica, German planes bombed civilians in support of Franco's forces. The town burned. Bodies lined the streets. Pablo Picasso painted what he saw in anguish. Franco, meanwhile, advanced with quiet certainty. By 1939, the war was over. The Republic lay in ruins. Spain's cities were exhausted. Its people scattered, some in exile, others in prison, many in graves. Franco declared victory, not as a revolutionary, not even as a general, but as the savior of a Spain he believed had nearly ceased to be. He did not call himself a dictator. He called himself El Caudillo, the leader. He abolished the Constitution, outlawed political parties, crushed unions, censored the press. Spain became a nation of whispered prayers and closed shutters. Franco restored the Catholic Church to central power. Priests returned to classrooms. Confession returned to daily life. He portrayed his regime as divinely ordained, a moral fortress against the godless chaos of modernity. For the first decade, repression ruled without apology. Tens of thousands of Republicans were imprisoned, executed, or disappeared. Children of leftists were placed with loyal families. The very language of resistance, Catalan, Basque, Galician, was banned in public. Culture was flattened. Uniformity became sacred. But Franco also knew how to wait. During World War II, while his allies in Italy and Germany plunged into disaster, Franco kept Spain neutral. He watched, measured, and avoided direct involvement. It was not a gesture of conscience, but of survival. After the war, as Europe rebuilt under democracy and American influence, Franco was shunned. Spain was poor, isolated, stuck in a past. The world was ready to forget, but then the Cold War began. And once again, Franco became useful. To the West, he was no longer just a dictator. He was an anti-communist. In the 1950s, the United States signed defense agreements with Spain. Military bases were built. Aid flowed in. Tourism grew. Spain's economy began to rise. Franco remained unmoved. He spoke rarely. He made no great speeches, but he ensured every move served his longevity. He created a facade of openness, allowing limited elections for local offices, permitting tightly controlled media. But the core never changed. He was Spain, and Spain was his to guard. Even into the 1960s and 70s, while revolutions roared in Paris, Prague, and beyond, Spain remained quiet. Modernization came. Highways, factories, universities. But always beneath the weight of memory and the threat of surveillance. Students protested. Strikes occurred. Bombings from Basque separatists erupted. Franco responded with calm repression. He was aging now. His voice slow. His presence symbolic. But his grip never loosened. In 1969, he named Prince Juan Carlos, the grandson of Spain's former king, as his successor. It was a surprising move. Franco had abolished the monarchy. Now, he restored it. On his terms. He believed Juan Carlos would continue his vision, a Spain of tradition, obedience, and silent unity. But history, like rivers, flows where it must. Franco died in 1970. A long illness, announced gently to the nation. Church bells tolled. Crowds gathered, some in grief, others in silence. And then, almost immediately, Spain began to change. Juan Carlos, against all expectation, led the country toward democracy. Political parties were legalized. Regional languages returned. Women voted freely. Newspapers criticized power. And for the first time in generations, Spain breathed deeply. There was no revolution, no civil war, only a turning slow, careful, profound. Franco's monuments remain. Some still debated, some removed. His body, once buried in a grand basilica he had built, was exhumed and moved quietly in Twin. His memory divides still. To some, he preserved Spain from chaos. To others, he drowned it in fear. But no one forgets. Not the graves in the valley. Not the children who hid their heritage. Not the poems that were never published. Not the long silence that hung for decades like a heavy wool curtain. Tonight, as the lights of Madrid flicker across rooftops and guitars whisper from quiet balconies, let the weight of history rest. Let the hush be gentle. Let the wind carry the old flags away. And let the silence belong to peace, not fear. The clock has moved on. The shutters are open. And Spain dreams its own dreams now, unspoken, uncommanded, and free. Beneath the gray skies of Bucharest, where tramlines hum and cold wind whispers through the trees, stands a colossal building, vast, heavy, and quiet. The People's Palace, they call it. One of the largest structures in the world, but its walls do not echo pride. They hold something heavier: silence, sorrow, and memory. This is the shadow of Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania's last communist leader, and his story is not one of simple tyranny, but of illusion stretched until it shattered. He was born in 1918, in a small village called Scornicești, the ninth child of a poor peasant family. His childhood was hard, not uncommon in rural Romania, but the hardship gave him something that would never leave: a hunger for control, and a belief that power could be mastered through loyalty and precision. At the age of 11, he left home and moved to Bucharest, working in factories. There he became involved in leftist politics, joining the illegal Communist Party. He was arrested several times, spending years in prison. It was in these grey echoing cells that he met Gheorghe, the future leader of communist Romania, and Ceausescu's path was sealed. When communism came to Romania after World War II, ushered in by Soviet influence, Ceausescu was pulled upward. Quiet, obedient, sharp-eyed, he was trusted. And in 1965, after Gheorghe's death, Ceausescu took his place. At first, the world watched with cautious hope. Ceausescu distanced himself from Moscow, refused to join the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and presented himself as an independent voice within the Eastern Bloc. He was praised in the West. He was welcomed in France, Britain, and even the United States. His leadership, it seemed, promised something new. But beneath the surface he was already building something very old, a kingdom of fear. He created a regime rooted in surveillance. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, became one of the most oppressive in the world. They recorded conversations in homes, intercepted letters, and planted informants in every corner of society. Paranoia became normal. Trust eroded. And the people learned to speak softly, even in their own kitchens. But Ceausescu offered a trade: silence for stability. He promised a strong Romania, self-reliant, sovereign, pure. He banned abortion and contraception, demanding higher birth rates to grow the nation. He outlawed homosexuality. He controlled education, religion, and media. Television was reduced to just a few hours a day, filled mostly with his speeches. And above all, he built statues, ministries, factories, but none so vast as the People's Palace, a project so enormous, it became a symbol of both obsession and detachment. In the 1980s, while Romanians queued for bread and shivered through winters without heat, Ceausescu poured resources into the palace. Entire neighborhoods in Bucharest were razed to make space. Churches, monasteries, historic homes gone. In their place rose a marble monument with 1,100 rooms, crystal chandeliers, silk curtains, and endless corridors. But it was not built for the people. It was built for him, as a stage for eternal power. He saw himself not merely as a leader, but as a father to the nation. He required school children to study his life. He created a scientific socialism doctrine around his words. He elevated his wife, Elena, to nearly equal power. Though she had no formal education in science, she was given titles in chemistry, biology, and engineering. Together, they became the symbolic parents of Romania. But the family they imagined was starving. The 1980s were brutal. Ceausescu, in an attempt to repay Romania's foreign debt, imposed extreme austerity. Food was rationed. Electricity was limited. Gasoline was scarce. People waited hours for basic goods. Hospitals lacked medicine. Children went cold in winter. Books were censored. Music silenced. And always, his speeches played a monotone reassurance that Romania was thriving. But the lies could no longer hold. In 1989, winds of change swept through Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell. Regimes collapsed. Protesters filled squares. And in Romania, something rare and irreversible happened. The people found their voice. It began in the city of Timișoara. A small protest against the removal of a Hungarian pastor grew. Police responded with force. But the protest did not shrink. It spread to students, workers, mothers. Soon, it reached Bucharest. On December 21st, Ceausescu addressed a crowd from the balcony of the Central Committee building. He spoke of enemies, of socialism, of unity. But something changed. The crowd booed. He blinked. For the first time in his reign, the silence cracked. That night, protests filled the city. By morning, soldiers had joined the people. The palace gates opened. Ceausescu and Elena fled by helicopter, then by car. They were captured a day later, tried in a rushed military tribunal, charged with genocide, corruption, and crimes against the state. On December 25, 1989, Christmas Day, they were executed by firing squad. The footage was later broadcast on national television. For a country that had lived under silence, the sound of their fall was deafening. In the years that followed, Romania struggled to rebuild, politically, economically, spiritually. The People's Palace remained too vast to demolish, too painful to ignore. Some saw it as a symbol of madness, others as a warning, and others still simply as a building that history could not erase. Today it houses parts of Romania's government, museums, and art galleries. Tourists walk through its halls, marveling at the chandeliers, the staircases, the eerie quiet. But the ghosts are there, not of the Sovietskas themselves, but of the millions who stood in line for food, who whispered in fear, who never dared dream aloud. Romania is a different country now, democratic, open, and healing. But memory lingers, in songs, in cracked sidewalks, in conversations that still trail off into caution. Tonight, let the lights dim softly across Bucharest. Let the wind drift past the palace, stirring nothing but leaves, and let the silence at last belong to peace, not power. The father is gone, the palace remains. But the people, they have awakened. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates wind like veins through the land and the sand remembers empires long vanished, rose a man who dreamed in ruins and ruled with fire. His name was Saddam Hussein. To some he was a modern Nebuchadnezzar, to others a tyrant in military dress. But to the people of Iraq, he was something more intimate, a presence that filled every hallway, every poster, every heartbeat beneath a heavy sky. He was born in 1937 in Al-Arja, a poor village near Tikrit, north of Baghdad. Orphaned young, raised in hardship, Saddam's early life was shadowed by violence and pride. Iraq, at the time, was a land trying to find its shape, emerging from British rule, torn by coups, rich in oil but poor in unity. At 20, Saddam joined the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, a political movement promising unity, nationalism, and Arab revival. He was not a scholar, he was not yet a soldier, but he understood loyalty and ambition. He had sharp eyes and a sharper silence. In 1959, he took part in an attempted assassination of then Prime Minister Abdelkarim Qasim. It failed. Saddam was wounded and fled the country. He returned years later, older, hardened, and prepared. By 1968, the Baathists had taken power in a bloodless coup. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam's cousin, became president, but behind the curtains, it was Saddam who began shaping the state, brick by brick, cell by cell. He controlled security. He managed intelligence. He eliminated rivals not by debate, but by disappearance. In 1979, al-Bakr resigned under pressure. Saddam Hussein took the presidency, and Iraq, ancient land of kings and clay tablets, became his theater. His first move was chilling. At a televised Ba'ath Party meeting, Saddam read out a list of named supposed traitors, collaborators with Syria. One by one they were led away. Some wept, others screamed. None returned. The message was clear. Loyalty was survival. Saddam projected strength with precision. His portrait was everywhere, on buildings, in classrooms, in the homes of citizens who dared not remove it. He wore tailored suits and military uniforms. He lit cigars, shook hands with diplomats, kissed babies, and ordered executions, all with the same studied calm. But it wasn't only fear he relied upon. It was spectacle. He built monuments in Baghdad, arches of swords, statues of himself on horseback, palaces carved from marble and gold. He restored ancient ruins in Babylon, even inscribing his name in imitation of the old kings, as if their crowns had passed into his hands. And yet, he positioned himself as a man of the people. He visited villages. He handed out cash to families. He kissed foreheads, praised martyrs, and spoke of Iraqi pride. He ruled with contradiction, a leader of myth and muscle, ruthlessness and charm. In 1980, he turned his ambitions outward. With Iran weakened by revolution, Saddam launched a full-scale invasion, hoping to seize disputed borderlands and assert Iraq as the dominant power in the Gulf. The war was long, 8 years, 1 million dead, and nothing gained. Iraqi soldiers fought with courage, but were sent into slaughter. Chemical weapons were used, including against Iran's forces, and in 1988 against Saddam's own people. In the Kurdish city of Halabja, thousands were killed by poison gas. Mothers cradled children who never woke. The air turned to ash. The silence afterward was unbearable. Saddam denied responsibility, but the world remembered. Still, he emerged from the war with a strange glory. He portrayed Iraq as victorious, unbroken, sovereign, proud. He celebrated with parades. He paid generous compensation to soldiers' families. He raised monuments again. But Iraq's economy was shattered. Debt to foreign creditors mounted. Oil prices fell, and the regime, once strong, grew brittle. In 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait. He claimed historical rights. He claimed resource disputes. But in truth, he believed the world would not intervene. He was wrong. The international response was swift. Sanctions, condemnation, and in early 1991, war. Operation Desert Storm unfolded with sudden force. US-led coalition airstrikes rained down. Tanks rolled across sand. In weeks, Iraq's military was devastated. Kuwait was freed. But Saddam remained. He crushed uprisings in the south and north. He drained marshes where Shia rebels hid. He bombed Kurdish strongholds. He fortified himself behind iron walls and shifting names. Sanctions tightened. Iraq's infrastructure decayed. Medicine grew scarce. Children grew thin. The people suffered, but the palaces remained lit. In Baghdad, power flickered, but Saddam's portraits never dimmed, and still he ruled. He published novels under pseudonyms. He praised poets who flattered him. He survived assassination attempts. He trusted no one, sometimes not even his sons, though they became brutal princes of their own. Uday and Qusay, known for cruelty, for opulence, for unchecked rage, were reflections of a father who had long ago embraced a world where might justified everything. In 2003, the final act came. The United States invaded Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction and links to terrorism. Saddam's regime collapsed quickly. Statues fell. Palaces were looted. Documents surfaced. Torture rooms, lavish bunkers, prison archives, all became testimony. Saddam fled into hiding. He was found in December, hiding in a dirt cellar near Tikrit, bearded, weary, and silent. His trial began in 2000. He appeared defiant. He spoke in court with fury and pride. But the verdict was clear: guilty of crimes against humanity. Hanged in December 2006. The footage leaked. The moment, crude and chaotic. A man who had once ruled with cinematic precision ended in grainy video and shouts in the dark. But his legacy did not vanish. Iraq fell into chaos. War, sectarian violence, and foreign occupation unraveled the very threads of the nation he had once controlled so tightly. To this day, Iraq walks in the shadows of that era, the echoes of his rule whispering through empty courtyards and still guarded checkpoints. Saddam Hussein built a state on fear, loyalty, and spectacle. He wrote his name in ancient stone, but history rewrote it in ash. Tonight, let the sands of Iraq settle under a gentler wind. Let the Tigris carry away the reflections of empire, and let the night be quiet, not with oppression, but with rest. The theater has emptied. The actor has gone. Only the dust remains, and the stories it carries. When morning light spills across the cobblestones of Rome and catches the edge of broken columns and worn statues, the city seems to breathe both memory and myth. It remembers emperors, artists, saints, and it remembers a man who sought to drape himself in all their legacies at once. Benito Mussolini did not walk softly. He marched, chin raised, chest out, voice sharpened into thunder. In his shadow, the architecture of ancient Rome stirred again, but so too did fear. Born in 1883 in the small town of Predapio in northern Italy, Mussolini was the son of a blacksmith and a devout schoolteacher. His father named him after Benito Juárez, the Mexican reformer, a symbol of resistance and independence. But Benito grew restless. He was intelligent, undisciplined, often violent. He was expelled from more than one school. Even as a youth, he had a taste for confrontation. He became a school teacher for a time, but soon gravitated toward politics, writing, and revolution. He joined the Socialist Party, rising as a journalist, passionate, provocative, persuasive. He praised class struggle. He spoke against monarchy. He called for change. But war changed him. When World War I erupted, Mussolini shocked his socialist peers by supporting Italy's entry into the conflict. He was expelled from the party, yet this break gave him space to reshape his ideology, to redefine power. After serving in the war, Mussolini returned to a fractured Italy. The economy was failing. Veterans returned to poverty. Workers struck. Elites trembled. The new democratic government struggled to hold balance. Into this uncertainty stepped Mussolini, and the movement he now led, fascism. Fascism, as Mussolini crafted it, was not deeply philosophical. It was visceral. It glorified the nation. It demanded obedience. It worshipped action, especially violence if it served unity. He formed black-shirt squads, paramilitary groups of veterans and loyalists. They attacked communists, broke up strikes, intimidated opponents. The state, too weak or too afraid, often looked the other way. In 1922, Mussolini made his boldest move. He organized a march on Rome, a spectacle more than a siege. Thousands of blackshirts descended on the capital, demanding change. The king, unwilling to risk civil war, appointed Mussolini as prime minister. He was 39 years old. At first, Mussolini governed within the bounds of legality. He made speeches about order and reform. He wore civilian clothes. He reassured institutions, but behind the scenes, he was tightening control. In 1924, a socialist deputy named Giacomo Matteotti gave a powerful speech in Parliament, condemning fascist violence and calling the recent elections fraudulent. Weeks later, Matteotti disappeared. His body was found in a shallow grave, stabbed and beaten. The public was outraged. Protests spread. The press exploded, but Mussolini survived. By 1925, he declared himself Il Duce, the leader. Political parties were banned. Independent newspapers were shut down. Opponents were arrested, exiled, or executed. And a new Italy was born, theatrical, militarized, and deeply afraid. Mussolini loved spectacle. He gave bombastic speeches from balconies, his arms slicing the air, posed shirtless on horseback. He orchestrated parades, torchlit marches, and massive public works. He paved roads, drained marshes, and electrified villages. He standardized schooling. He introduced grand architecture, meant to echo the strength of ancient Rome. He declared that fascism would bring a new Roman Empire. But beneath the polished surface, his control was brittle. Italy's economy lagged. Many of his reforms faltered. His cult of personality became a mask for weak institutions. Still, Mussolini pressed outward. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few African countries still independent. Italian forces, using poison gas and modern artillery, quickly subdued Ethiopian resistance. The international community condemned the invasion, but Mussolini reveled in the conquest. He proclaimed that Italy had an empire again, and that he was its Caesar. The following year, Mussolini grew closer to Adolf Hitler. At first, he had mocked Hitler's race theories and called his party a brutish imitation. But as Germany's power grew, so did Mussolini's admiration, and soon their regimes aligned. Italy passed racial laws. Jews were banned from professions and universities. Books were censored. The press turned to pure propaganda. And then, in 1940, Mussolini made a fateful decision. As World War II escalated and Germany invaded France, Mussolini joined the Axis. He believed the war would be short, a chance to share in Germany's victories, to carve new colonies for Italy. Instead, it became his undoing. Italian forces struggled. Campaigns in North Africa and Greece failed. German troops had to bail them out. At home, bombings began. Food grew scarce. Faith in the regime cracked. By 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Mussolini's own government turned against him. He was arrested, deposed by the very king who had once empowered him. But Hitler rescued him. German commandos extracted Mussolini and placed him in charge of a puppet regime in northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic. It was a ghost state, propped up by German guns. And Mussolini was a ghost of himself. He no longer gave fiery speeches. His face had aged. His voice dimmed. He wrote dark reflections about fate, betrayal, mortality. As the war neared its end, Mussolini attempted to flee. In April 1945, he and his mistress Clara Petacci disguised themselves and tried to cross into Switzerland. They were caught by Italian partisans near Lake Como. On April 28, they were executed, shot without ceremony, without trial. Their bodies were hung upside down in Milan, displayed in a public square. For a man who had once commanded Rome's stage, his final act was one of humiliation, not tragedy. But his shadow lingered. Fascism, as a word, as an idea, did not die with Mussolini. It spread. It shifted. It became a warning. A word whispered when power begins to swell without restraint. Italy, after the war, abolished the monarchy. It rebuilt its democracy. It slowly unwrapped the silence that had wrapped its past. And still, each time the city of Rome breathes, it exhales all its memories, not just of emperors and marble, but of banners and boots, balconies and fear. Tonight, let the columns stand still in the moonlight. Let the Tiber carry away the echoes of old slogans, and let the stones beneath your feet feel light again, no longer burdened by the weight of marching. The leader is gone, the theater is quiet, and Rome dreams once more in peace. In the vast heart of Africa, where the Congo River curls like a great green serpent through rainforests, older than empires, one man wrapped himself in the symbols of power, animal skins, gold-tipped canes, and the borrowed echoes of kings. Mobutu Sese Seko was not merely a ruler, he was an architect of illusion, a man who wore a leopard print hat and named an entire nation after himself. Born Joseph Désiré Mobutu in 1930, in the town of Lisala, he entered a world shaped by Belgian colonialism. The Congo, vast and rich with minerals, rubber, and timber, was then a territory held tightly in foreign hands. Its people denied education, rights, or representation. But Mobutu stood out. He was intelligent, ambitious, fluent in French, and skilled with words. He joined the Force Publique, the colonial army, as a young man, and later moved into journalism. From there, he entered politics during one of the most fragile moments in modern African history. In 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium. Jubilation filled the streets, but beneath the celebration was chaos. Ethnic divisions, weak institutions, and foreign interests clashed almost immediately. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister, was a fiery nationalist, determined to free Congo not only from colonial rule but also from neo-colonial manipulation. Mobutu served as his army chief. But very soon foreign powers grew nervous about Lumumba's alignment with the Soviet Union. Within months, the young republic began to unravel. Mobutu, quiet and calculating, struck when the moment came. With backing from Belgium and the CIA, he seized power in a military coup. Lumumba was arrested, handed over to rivals, and ultimately murdered in secret. Mobutu, still only in his early 30s, stepped into the growing vacuum. He did not yet declare himself a dictator. He spoke instead of unity, of anti-communism, of discipline. In 1965, he took full control of the country, and he began a long performance, not just of leadership, but of transformation. He renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngandu Wazabang, roughly translated, the all-powerful warrior who goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. He renamed the country too. The Congo became Zaire. Cities, rivers and streets were given African names. Western-style suits were banned in favor of the abakust, a collarless tunic worn as a symbol of African authenticity. He banned European names. He pushed an ideology called authenticity, meant to purge colonial influence from Zairian life. But beneath the cultural revival lay a different kind of rule, one held together not by belief, but by fear, spectacle and wealth. Mobutu was a master of image. He adorned himself in leopard skin hats and gold-rimmed sunglasses. His portrait hung in every classroom and office. His speeches were broadcast across the country. He flew in a Concorde jet, hosted dignitaries in palatial estates, and lived with the pomp of a monarch. He projected himself as the father of the nation, omnipresent and benevolent. But behind the grand image, his regime was deeply corrupt. Mobutu turned Zaire's state treasury into his personal bank account. Billions in foreign aid, meant for infrastructure, hospitals, education, flowed into private estates, overseas investments, and luxury. He rewarded loyalty with cash, contracts, and favors. He punished dissent with exile, prison, or silence. And still, the world played along. During the Cold War, Mobutu became a vital ally to the West. He was anti-communist, strategically placed, and politically flexible. The United States, Belgium, and France sent money, weapons, and praise. In return, Mobutu presented himself as the strong man Africa needed. He once declared, "There is no opposition in Zaire. There are only traitors." And in many ways, the world nodded. He built few roads. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Teachers were unpaid. But the facade, the image of a stable, pro-Western leader remained. Perhaps nowhere was Mobutu's hunger for grandeur clearer than in 1974, when he hosted one of the most surreal events in modern history, the Rumble in the Jungle. Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, two of the greatest boxers alive, fought in Kinshasa. Mobutu poured millions into the event. He built stadiums, hosted musicians, and filled the capital with celebration. For one night, Zaire was the center of the world, and Mobutu stood proudly at its heart. But even illusion cannot outlast time. In the 1980s, global dynamics shifted. The Cold War cooled. The West grew less dependent on authoritarian allies. Mobutu's usefulness declined. At home, the economy collapsed. Currency was devalued. Schools deteriorated, and hunger spread. Yet, Mobutu remained. He juggled rivals. He stirred ethnic tensions. He promised reform, held staged elections, and silenced critics anew. But the air had changed. In the early 1990s, as pro-democracy movements swept across Africa, pressure mounted. Mobutu agreed to allow multi-party politics. But delays, manipulation, and repression followed. By then, his health was failing. He suffered from prostate cancer. He spent increasing time abroad in Switzerland, Morocco, France, receiving treatment and retreating from reality. In 1994, when the genocide in Rwanda sent shockwaves across Central Africa, Zaire became a refuge for fleeing Hutu militias. The region grew unstable, and in 1996, a rebel movement emerged, led by Laurent Désiré Kabila and backed by Rwanda and Uganda. Their march was swift. Mobutu's once loyal army folded. City after city fell. In 1997, after more than 3 decades in power, Mobutu fled. He boarded a plane with family, guards, and suitcases of cash. His palaces, filled with golden doorknobs and velvet chairs, were left behind. Zaire was renamed again back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu died months later in Morocco, exiled, powerless, unmourned, but his legacy remained. The institutions he hollowed never truly recovered. The culture of corruption, personalism, and fear continued. The DRC descended into war, a conflict so vast and devastating it became known as Africa's World War. And still today, in villages by the Congo River, in cities that remember his smile and his silence, people speak his name with a strange mixture of awe, disdain, and disbelief. He was the man who ruled a jungle kingdom with mirrors and masks, the leopard who prowled through palaces of his own design, the president who became a king and then a memory. Tonight, let the great river flow gently beneath the stars. Let the forest breathe without command, and let the sound of power fade, replaced by the soft rustle of rain on leaves. The leopard hat rests now. The statues crack in the sun, but the trees, they keep growing. When the Balkans sleep, they dream in fragments of mountains and rivers, of songs in many tongues, of fires lit and forgotten. They remember empires that rose, shattered, and rose again. And among those memories, heavy and recent, lies the shadow of a man who spoke of unity yet brought division, who swore to defend peace but dragged his people through war. Slobodan Milošević was born in 1941 in Požarevac, a modest town in Serbia, during the fires of World War II. His early years were marked by both war and silence. His father, a former Orthodox priest, later took his own life. His mother, a devout communist, did the same years later. This sorrow would not define Milošević outwardly, but it haunted the stillness behind his eyes. He was a quiet student, deliberate and ambitious. In Belgrade he studied law and joined the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. He rose not through rebellion, but through bureaucracy. A man who understood systems and learned to move within them. For most of his early career, Milošević was seen as a technocrat. He managed gas companies. He traveled. He dressed in muted suits and rarely raised his voice. He was not yet the man who would later bring thunder to nationalist crowds, but he was listening and watching. Yugoslavia, then, was a complex creation. Formed after World War I, it was a federation of 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia, and 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina. It was bound together by a shared identity that sat lightly atop deep ethnic, religious, and historical divisions. For decades, the strong hand of Josip Broz Tito had kept those tensions contained. But when Tito died in 1980, the seams began to show. Economic decline and political uncertainty gave way to renewed tribal fears. The center was fraying. Milošević saw something in this, not just danger but opportunity. In 1987, as party leader in Serbia, he visited Kosovo, where tensions between the majority ethnic Albanians and the minority Serbs had grown volatile. When police clashed with Serbian protesters, Milošević declared, "No one should dare to beat you again." The phrase echoed across Serbia like a drum. It was a turning point. He had spoken not as a communist official but as a Serbian protector, and for many it felt like awakening. From that moment, Milošević reshaped himself. The quiet bureaucrat became a firebrand. He invoked history, tales of Ottoman conquest, medieval battles, and Christian martyrs. He stoked fears that Serbs were being persecuted in Kosovo and elsewhere. He wrapped himself in national flags and ancient wounds. By 1989 he had risen to the presidency of Serbia, and with him came a wave of centralization. He moved to weaken the autonomy of Kosovo and Vojvodina. He pushed to expand Serbia's influence over the Yugoslav Federation. He claimed to protect unity, but only on terms that favored one republic over the rest. Other regions watched with unease. Croatia and Slovenia, wealthier and more Western-leaning, began to resist. Nationalism rose across borders. Old animosities, barely sleeping, stirred awake. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. The Yugoslav People's Army, under Serbian dominance, moved in. Slovenia's conflict was brief. But in Croatia, war exploded. Towns shelled, villages burned, civilians caught in the crossfire. Ethnic cleansing became a phrase that haunted the headlines. And Milosevic, though rarely on the front lines, was always present in the machinery behind it. He backed Serbian militias and paramilitary groups. He supplied weapons. He controlled media that painted Croats and Muslims as fascists, traitors, or threats. Then came Bosnia, a republic woven from Muslims, Croats, and Serbs. It was a mirror of Yugoslavia itself. When Bosnia declared independence in 1992, it triggered the most brutal war Europe had seen since 1945. For 3 years, the land was torn by siege and slaughter. In Sarajevo, snipers targeted children. In Srebrenica, over 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered in cold blood. Villages were emptied. Mosques were demolished. Mass graves spread like bruises beneath the soil. Milosevic, throughout, denied direct involvement. He spoke of diplomacy. He attended peace talks. But behind the curtains, the support continued. Military aid, political backing, silent approvals. The world condemned the violence. Sanctions were imposed. The West threatened intervention. In 1995, under mounting pressure and shifting military fortunes, the Dayton Accords were signed. The war ended. Bosnia was preserved, divided, fragile, grieving, and yet Milosevic remained. In 1997, he became president of the new Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, now just Serbia and Montenegro, weakened, sanctioned, and isolated. He still held power, but another wound was festering in Kosovo. Ethnic Albanians, long marginalized under Milosevic's rule, demanded autonomy. Tensions boiled into violence. Serbian security forces launched brutal crackdowns. In 1999, NATO intervened. Airstrikes rained on Belgrade. Bridges, factories, even television stations were hit. The bombing campaign lasted 78 days. And though Kosovo remained officially part of Serbia, Milosevic agreed to withdraw forces. His grip had loosened. At home, the people were growing weary, not just of war, but of poverty, repression, and isolation. Mass protests grew. Students marched. The currency collapsed. In 2000, after a disputed election, the people rose again, this time in final defiance. Hundreds of thousands filled the streets. Police refused orders. The parliament was stormed, and Milosevic, the man who once commanded nations to fear, quietly stepped down. He was arrested in 2001 and handed over to the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. He was charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity for actions in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. He defended himself in court, denying responsibility, calling the tribunal illegitimate. But he would never hear a verdict. In 2006, before the trial concluded, Milosevic died in his prison cell. A heart attack. They said he was sick. His funeral in Serbia was attended by mourners and nationalists, but also by silence. The wars he had stirred left over 100,000 dead, millions displaced, a region scarred by suspicion and sorrow. Today, the Balkans still carry the echoes of those years. Flags flutter, church bells ring, and sometimes old songs return, full of memory, pride, and warning. Milosevic ruled with the language of history, but he left behind a broken one. Tonight, let the rivers of the Balkans flow calmly beneath their bridges. Let the mountains exhale mist instead of smoke. And let the cities sleep, not in fear, but in slow, hard-won peace. The voice has fallen silent, the ashes settle, and the land begins to heal. In the rugged hills of Albania, where the wind sighs across stone and the soil clings to memory, there lie thousands of silent domes, concrete bunkers, small and round like scattered seeds of fear. They rest on beaches, in fields between crumbling walls and quiet lanes, and they all whisper the same name, Enver Hoxha. Few ruled so long. Fewer ruled so secretly, and none perhaps built a prison out of an entire country quite like he did. Born in 1908 in the southern Albanian town of Gedrokasta, Enver Hoxha grew up in a land still adjusting to independence. Albania had recently broken from the Ottoman Empire, only to stumble through kingship, war, and foreign meddling. His father was a cloth merchant, his mother devout. Enver was clever, withdrawn, and observant. As a young man, he studied in France and Belgium, drawn to Marxist circles and revolutionary thinking. He never finished a degree, expelled for poor attendance and radical ideas. Yet ideas were his fuel. He returned home with them burning in his mind. By the early 1940s, fascist Italy had invaded Albania. A puppet king sat on the throne. German forces followed. The country, battered and confused, became a crossroads of occupation. But beneath the silence, resistance stirred. Hoxha co-founded the Albanian Communist Party in 1941. Charismatic and secretive, he quickly rose as its leader. He organized partisans in the hills. He coordinated sabotage, ambushes, and rallies, all with a message of liberation wrapped in Marxist resolve. When the war ended and the Nazis withdrew, it was Hoxha's partisans who filled the vacuum. He didn't wait for permission. He declared a People's Republic. He became its first secretary, and thus began one of the most totalitarian regimes in modern European history. At first, Hoxha modeled Albania after Stalin's Soviet Union. He nationalized land. He closed churches and mosques. He silenced dissent. He abolished royalty, private property, and foreign press. He created a one-party state, where the party was not a political tool but a doctrine, unchallengeable, sacred, absolute. In the early years, Albania leaned heavily on Soviet support. Stalin admired Hoxha's rigidity. They shared ideology, paranoia, and a belief in purifying revolution. Under their partnership, Albania modernized, slowly, selectively. Roads were built. Dams rose. Literacy campaigns swept the countryside. But in 1953, Stalin died, and with him, the bond began to fray. Nikita Khrushchev took power in the USSR. He criticized Stalin's excesses. He introduced reforms. He spoke of peaceful coexistence with the West. Hoxha, in turn, recoiled. To him, de-Stalinization was betrayal. He denounced Khrushchev publicly. He called Soviet leaders revisionists. And in 1961, Albania broke ties with the USSR, the only Eastern Bloc country to do so. Hoxha turned instead to Maoist China. For a time, Beijing became Tirana's lifeline. China sent aid, grain, machinery. In return, Hoxha praised Mao, mimicked his purges, and further tightened control. He saw enemies in ideas. He feared Western music, long hair, and blue jeans. He banned foreign films. He shut Albania's borders, not metaphorically, physically. Anyone caught attempting to flee faced execution or internment. Tourists were few. Letters were read. Phones were tapped, and every citizen knew someone might be listening. In the 1960s and 70s, Hoxha's rule deepened in suspicion. He built bunkers, tens of thousands of them, round, thick, squat fortresses with rifle slits. Each one meant to resist invaders that never came. Families were assigned to maintain them. Children played near them. And as the years passed, they became part of the landscape, like warning signs carved into the earth itself. The obsession with defense was not only external. Internally, Hoxha waged his own silent war against dissidents, artists, intellectuals, even former allies. Many were executed. Others disappeared into labor camps. Some survived, broken and forgotten. He crushed religion too, not just through law but through culture. In 1967, Hoxha declared Albania the world's first atheist state. Churches became warehouses. Mosques turned into sports halls. Priests and imams were arrested. Religious holidays were banned. Faith was replaced by ideology, and ideology had only one prophet, Enver Hoxha. His writings filled bookstores. His speeches became curriculum. His name was spoken with reverence, or not at all. Children pledged loyalty not to family, but to the party. Spouses informed on spouses. A society of whispers emerged, where silence became the safest sound. And all the while the world outside moved forward. The Cold War shifted. China opened to the West. Communist regimes began to adapt, but Albania remained frozen, sealed in its own design. By the 1980s, the economy had withered. Factories produced little. His farms struggled. Electricity was rationed. Food lines grew long. But propaganda continued. Pictures of smiling farmers, workers celebrating the harvest, and Hoxha waving from balconies no one could approach. He aged, slowly and visibly. Still writing, still warning, still watching. In 1985, after over 40 years in power, Enver Hoxha died of heart failure. His funeral was broadcast, somber and orchestrated. The nation mourned, publicly. Privately, many simply waited. His successor, Ramiz Alia, began to loosen control slightly, cautiously, but the grip could not hold. By 1991, with communism collapsing across Eastern Europe, Albania too began to open. Protests erupted. Statues fell. Elections were held. The party lost power, and the country stepped into the unknown. The years that followed were hard. Poverty deepened. A financial crisis triggered riots. But slowly, Albania found its breath again. Today, the bunkers still remain. Some have been turned into cafes, others into museums or canvases for street art. Many simply sit, moss-covered, rusted, and still. They remind the people of what was, not as nostalgia but as memory. Enver Hoxha ruled not with armies, but with architecture of fear, in the minds of his people, in the shape of the land, in the silence between conversations. He built a nation apart, and in doing so built a prison from which it took decades to escape. Tonight, let the bunkers sleep. Let the wind pass through their empty doorways, and let the land soften again, under open sky, with open borders, and voices unafraid to rise. The architect is gone. His concrete dreams crumble, and Albania, once so isolated, now learns to join the world, slowly but freely. As the moonlight spills across the boulevards of Bucharest, one building casts a shadow longer than any other, a colossus of white stone and marble, windowed and walled in quiet grandeur. The People's Palace, grand, imposing and strange, it stands as the second largest administrative building in the world. But to many Romanians it is not just a palace, it is a wound, a monument not to glory but to the man who built it. Nicolae Ceausescu. Born in 1918 in the small village of Scornicești, Ceausescu came from humble roots. His family were peasants, and the young Nicolae grew up amidst hardship, scarcity and rigid discipline. He left home early and moved to Bucharest, where he became an apprentice shoemaker, but he was drawn to politics more than trade. By age 14 he had joined the illegal Communist Party of Romania, a movement then banned and hunted by the ruling monarchy. He was arrested more than once for agitation and activism. Prison became his second school. There he met senior communists, absorbed ideology, and earned a reputation for loyalty and cunning. When World War II ended and Soviet forces swept into Eastern Europe, Ceausescu's chance arrived. In 1947, Romania's monarchy was abolished. A People's Republic was declared, backed by the USSR. The Communist Party took control. Ceausescu climbed the ranks slowly, first as a military official, then as a party organizer. He watched, listened, and waited. When Gheorghe Duje, Romania's longtime communist leader, died in 1965, Ceausescu assumed power. Few noticed at first. He was not seen as charismatic or bold, but soon a transformation began. He styled himself as Romania's visionary. He promoted independence from Moscow. He refused to join the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 19. He opened limited trade with the West. Leaders in Paris and Washington welcomed him, hoping he might be a moderate among hardliners. But the image masked a deeper ambition. Ceausescu believed in control, not just over policy, but over people's thoughts, identities, and futures. He expanded the secret police, the Securitate, into one of the most feared institutions in Eastern Europe. They tapped phones, read letters, followed citizens. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Even whispers could bring interrogation. He launched a cult of personality that rivaled the world's most extreme. His face adorned stamps, statues, and textbooks. Children sang songs in his honor. Schools taught his speeches. Television played his visits to factories, where workers clapped on cue and no machine ran until he arrived. His wife, Elena Ceausescu, joined in the illusion. Though lacking scientific credentials, she was granted high academic titles, paraded as a chemist, and given top positions in the government. Together, they styled themselves as the mother and father of the nation. But perhaps no symbol better reveals Ceausescu's rule than the People's Palace, or as he called it, the House of the Republic. In the 1980s, as Romania's economy teetered and basic goods grew scarce, Ceausescu unveiled his most ambitious project. Inspired by visits to North Korea and China, he dreamed of remaking Bucharest in his image, orderly, imperial, and eternal. To build the palace, he ordered the demolition of an entire historic district. Churches were razed, hospitals torn down, homes flattened. Over 40,000 people were displaced. Construction began in 1984, mobilizing tens of thousands of workers. The building rose, floor by floor, hall by hall, in blinding stone and eerie silence. Every chandelier, carpet, and staircase was crafted by hand. Romanian artisans labored day and night to fulfill the vision. And yet, while the palace grew, the nation shrank. Ceausescu had taken on enormous foreign debt in the 1970s. To repay it, he imposed brutal austerity. He cut imports. He rationed food, fuel, and electricity. He exported grain while citizens lined up for bread. Apartments were cold. Shops were empty. Doctors lacked medicine. Children went to school hungry. Still, the propaganda machine insisted all was well. News broadcasts showed grand parades, choreographed dances, and harvest festivals no one attended. Ceausescu spoke of strength, dignity, and self-reliance. But beneath the slogans, the people whispered of fatigue, fear, and disbelief. By the late 1980s, revolutions were sweeping across Eastern Europe. In Poland, solidarity rose. In East Germany, the Berlin Wall fell. In Czechoslovakia, protests filled the squares. But in Romania, the silence endured. Until it didn't. In December 1989, in the city of Timișoara, a protest began. Small, local, centered around a pastor threatened with exile. The demonstration grew. The army fired on civilians. Instead of scattering, more came. Thousands. The unrest spread. On December 21st, Ceausescu stood on the balcony of the Communist Party headquarters in Bucharest, addressing a crowd, as he had done countless times before. But something had changed. Mid-speech, the audience turned. Boos rose. People jeered. The broadcast cut out. The illusion cracked. The next day, chaos consumed the capital. The army joined the protesters. The government collapsed. Ceausescu and his wife fled by helicopter, only to be captured within hours. They were held, tried in a makeshift court, and on December 25th, executed by firing squad. The images of their final moments, hurried and harsh, spread across the world. The regime that had lasted for decades ended in a single week. After their deaths, Romanians poured into the streets. Statues were toppled. Songs once banned were sung again. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the silence had been broken. Today, the People's Palace still stands. It now houses Romania's parliament. Tourists walk through its vast halls, past chandeliers heavier than cars, into rooms that once waited for a ruler who never fully moved in. The building, both admired and resented, remains the most physical reminder of Ceausescu's legacy, a dream of permanence built on impermanence. Romania has changed. It is now part of the European Union. Its cities pulse with new life. Its people speak freely. But the past is still there, in memories, in scars, in conversations that pause before certain names. Ceausescu promised eternity. He built with stone and silence. But no building, however grand, can silence a people forever. Tonight, as the lights dim over Bucharest, let the palace rest without pageantry. Let its chambers echo not with commands, but with memory. And let the streets outside remain open, for voices, for laughter, for the ordinary grace of freedom. The microphones are off, the portraits are down, and a nation, once bound by illusion, dreams again in truth. The river runs wide through the heart of Africa, slow, winding, eternal. It carries stories in its current and silence in its depth. Along its banks, where jungle presses close and mist clings to the trees, one of the darkest chapters in modern history unfolded. A chapter not of ancient war, but of modern greed. A story not of a native king or warlord, but of a European monarch who ruled a distant land he never set foot in. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians, and the Congo was his private possession. He wore fine gloves, lived in palaces, and spoke with aristocratic charm. But beyond his polished image lay an ambition both vast and ruthless. While other European powers scrambled to divide Africa in the late 19th century, Leopold sought something more personal, an empire of his own. Belgium was a small, young nation. Its place on the world stage was modest, but Leopold dreamed of grandeur, of colonies, riches, and legacy. And so he turned his eyes to the Congo Basin, a region the size of Western Europe, rich in rubber, ivory, forests, and waterways. In 1876 he founded the International African Association, claiming humanitarian goals to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to Africa's heart. It was a careful task. He hired explorers, most famously Henry Morton Stanley, to map and claim land under the guise of treaties with local leaders. These treaties, written in European languages and full of unfamiliar terms, often signed under duress or deceit, handed vast territories to Leopold's control. By 1885, at the Berlin Conference, a gathering of European powers to divide Africa among themselves, Leopold's claim was recognized. He was granted personal ownership of the Congo Free State, not as a colony of Belgium, but as his private domain. It was a legal fiction, but the consequences were tragically real. He ruled not as a king, but as a profiteer. His agents were given quotas: ivory to collect, rubber to harvest, taxes to extract. Villages were ordered to provide labor. Those who failed faced punishment. Brutal punishment. Men were whipped with a chicote, a cruel whip made of hippo hide. Entire villages were burned, children taken hostage to ensure parental compliance. And most chilling of all, to prove bullets were not wasted, soldiers were required to return with the severed hands of those they shot. The result was systematic terror. Hands were taken not only from the dead, but from the living. Children lost limbs. Women were mutilated. Men were executed to set examples. And through it all, Leopold remained in Brussels, untouched, unseeing, but profiting. The Congo Free State became a rubber empire. The demand for rubber had exploded with the rise of bicycles, automobiles, and machinery. Leopold's companies made enormous profits. Belgium grew richer, but the people of the Congo paid with their bodies and their lives. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 8 to 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's rule. some from direct violence, others from famine, exhaustion, disease, all consequences of the brutal system imposed upon them. And yet for years, the world turned away. Belgium celebrated Leopold as a visionary. He built monuments. He commissioned grand buildings. He funded museums, parks, and universities, all with wealth taken from a land whose people had no voice. But eventually, the truth began to leak through the cracks. Missionaries, journalists, and former officials, people like George Washington Williams, an African-American historian, and E.D. Morrell, a British shipping clerk turned activist, began to speak out. They published reports. They collected testimonies. They showed photographs of severed hands, starving children, and burning homes. A movement began to swell. Writers, politicians, and churches demanded accountability. And slowly, the image of Leopold the benefactor began to erode. In 1908, under immense pressure, Leopold was forced to cede the Congo Free State, not to the Congolese but to the Belgian government. The private colony became the Belgian Congo. And while conditions slowly improved under formal colonial rule, the scars left by Leopold's reign never fully healed. He died the following year, in 1909, shunned by much of Europe, but still celebrated by some at home. Thousands attended his funeral. But as his coffin passed, crowds jeered, a rare moment of open defiance. Too late, but not forgotten. Today, his monuments still stand in parts of Belgium, though many are now debated, defaced, or removed. In the Congo, his name is spoken with bitterness. His legacy, unlike his buildings, cannot be buried. The People's Palace in Kinshasa, the dusty rail lines that snake through forest, the crumbling colonial outposts, all whisper the same story. That power, when cloaked in civilization, but driven by greed, can wound more deeply than war. And the Congo, a land of rich rivers and gentle forests, still carries that history in its soil. Children play near trees that once bled sap for rubber. Elders tell stories, not from books but from memory, of families broken, languages lost, and lives undone. But the story of the Congo is not only a tragedy, it is also one of survival. Despite exploitation, the Congolese people held on to their identities, their songs, their stories. They endured, adapted, and resisted in small ways and large. And though the legacy of colonialism remains heavy, their spirit has never been extinguished. Tonight, let the Congo River run quietly under starlight. Let the jungle breathe freely. Let the ghosts of exploitation fade into the mist. And may the world, which once looked away, keep watch a little more closely. The hands once severed now build. The voices once silenced now rise. And the land, long wounded, continues to grow. The Caribbean, warm and drowsy beneath a velvet night sky, holds the memory of waves and whispers, soft winds against the palms, salt settling on painted walls, and somewhere deeper, the echo of boots on tiled floors. In the Dominican Republic, not far from sunlit beaches and sugarcane fields, lived a man who dressed in medals, cloaked himself in mirrors, and ruled with the quiet cruelty of a man obsessed with his own reflection. His name was Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina. He called himself El Jefe, the boss. But to the people he became something stranger, a name spoken aloud with praise, but privately with dread. His regime was one of fear, wrapped in formality, of parades beneath rifles, of silence masquerading as peace. Trujillo was born in 1891, in San Cristobal, a modest town nestled among green hills and dusted sunlight. His family was not wealthy. He studied in local schools, worked humble jobs, and by his teenage years had already begun reshaping his path. He joined the National Guard in 1918, an institution trained and organized by the occupying U.S. Marines, who had intervened in the Dominican Republic's chaotic politics. Trujillo proved himself quickly, not for kindness or valor, but for discipline, ambition, and a cold willingness to do what others wouldn't. By 1930, through manipulation, betrayal, and staged rebellion, he seized power. He stood for election, the only candidate, and one with over 99% of the vote. And from that moment, he ruled as though the nation was an extension of his uniform. He renamed streets, cities, and mountains after himself. The capital, Santo Domingo, became Ciudad Trujillo. Churches displayed his portrait beside Christ's. Children recited oaths of loyalty to him in school. He was always watching, or rather demanding to be watched. His face appeared on coins, his initials on public buildings. Even his birthday was declared a national holiday. Yet beneath this carefully crafted image, the Dominican Republic drifted into silence. Trujillo wielded a network of secret police, known as the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, SIM, a force that penetrated every layer of society. They listened, watched, followed, and killed. No one was immune. Professors, priests, business owners, even family members, all were watched. Prisons became overcrowded with those who spoke too freely. Many simply vanished. And though the streets were often clean and orderly, they were also tense, a kind of hush that settled even over laughter. His rule, however, was not just about fear. It was about control through appearances. Trujillo styled himself impeccably. White gloves, polished shoes, stiff posture. He commissioned thousands of photographs. He gave speeches filled with grandeur, promising stability, growth, and pride. Infrastructure projects were undertaken. Schools, roads, hospitals, many bore his name. He cultivated a kind of order, but it was the order of a locked. Beneath that image, inequality remained. Corruption bloomed, tucked behind official smiles. Trujillo enriched himself beyond imagination. At one point, he personally owned 60% of the country's sugar industry. His family controlled banks, import businesses, cattle ranches. He bled the nation not in chaos but in contracts, in tariffs, in quiet decrees signed in polished halls. And yet, his most notorious act would unfold in a single bloody night. Along the northern border with Haiti, Trujillo ordered what became known as the Parsley Massacre. Haitian migrants, tens of thousands, lived and worked in Dominican border regions. Trujillo, always obsessed with racial purity and Dominican identity, saw them as a threat. Over 5 days, Dominican soldiers and civilians swept through the borderlands. They asked dark-skinned residents to pronounce the word perejil, Spanish for parsley. Those who failed, who spoke with the accent of Creole, were marked. Between 10,000 and 20,000 Haitians were murdered. Some with machetes, others with rifles. Many bodies were thrown into rivers to carry the evidence away. The massacre was brutal and for many unexpected. But for Trujillo, it was calculated. He later offered a formal apology to Haiti, paired with a payment of $750,000, a gesture not of remorse but diplomacy. International condemnation was limited. The world, still distant, returned to its silence. Decade by decade, Trujillo's grip remained unbroken. He ruled for 31 years, with only 2 brief interruptions, both filled by puppet presidents. Even when he formally stepped down, he remained the puppet master. His face still loomed on walls. His decisions still shaped lives. His presence still weighed heavy in every room. He used the military, the church, and the press as tools. He crushed opposition before it could take root. He gave the illusion of progress, even as fear hollowed the state from within. But the world began to shift. In the 1950s, Trujillo's reputation, once tolerated, began to wear thin. He supported anti-communist causes abroad, but also waged personal vendettas. He attempted to assassinate the president of Venezuela, Romulo Betancourt, an act that embarrassed and outraged other Latin American nations. The United States, once a silent partner, began to withdraw support. The Organization of American States imposed sanctions. And within the Dominican Republic, murmurs of resistance grew louder. Then came the Mirabal sisters. 3 sisters, Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa, became symbols of resistance. Known as Las Mariposas, the butterflies, they denounced Trujillo's violence advocated for democracy, and inspired quiet defiance. On November 25, 1960, the sisters were ambushed and murdered by Trujillo's agents. The regime claimed it was an accident, but few believed it. Their deaths sparked outrage. Even those once silent began to stir. By 1961, the plot to remove Trujillo had begun. A group of military men, businessmen and civilians conspired. They tracked his movements, planned, quietly, patiently. And on May 30, 1961, as Trujillo traveled along a familiar coastal road in his chauffeured Chevrolet, the ambush began. Gunfire tore through the night. El Jefe was killed. The man who had ruled like a god bled like any other. His body was buried in secret, later exhumed. Eventually exiled from Dominican soil, the regime unraveled swiftly. His family fled. Statues fell. Ciudad Trujillo returned to its name, Santo Domingo. Today, the Dominican Republic bears the traces of Trujillo in both scars and silence. Many who lived through those years still remember the way the air felt during his speeches, heavy, rehearsed. The way fear lived in doorways. How mirrors were turned inward. The Mirabal sisters are now honored with monuments and a national day of remembrance. Their home, preserved as a museum, draws visitors seeking to understand the price of resistance. And Trujillo, his name is rarely spoken with reverence. Yet his story remains, as warning, as history, as a mirror held up to power. Tonight, let the warm winds brush gently across the hills of the Caribbean. Let the sugarcane rustle with peace, not panic. Let the people sleep with doors unlocked and names unfeared. The mirror has shattered. The medals gather dust, and the land, long observed, finally watches back, free, aware, and awake. The desert remembers, even as sand shifts and winds change, even as cities rise and fall. The land holds memory beneath its golden veil, and in the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once cradled the world's earliest civilizations, the name Saddam Hussein still lingers, not as a whisper, but as a shadow, a man who rose through the dust of poverty, cloaked himself in revolution, and built a kingdom of palaces, fear, and illusion. Born in 1937 in a mud-brick village near Tikrit, Saddam came into the world amid hardship. His father vanished before his birth, and his early years were marked by neglect, resentment, and survival. Raised by his stepfather, a man known for cruelty, Saddam learned early that power was something to be seized, not offered. As a young man, he was drawn to nationalist politics. He joined the Ba'ath Party, an Arab socialist movement that promised unity, modernity, and strength, all woven with the rhetoric of revolution. Iraq at the time was a monarchy under British influence, and the idea of a republic stirred the hearts of many. In 1959, Saddam took part in a failed attempt to assassinate Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. Wounded in the chaos, he fled to Syria, then Egypt, where he studied law and deepened his political ties. He returned to Iraq in the 1960s, and when the Baathists finally seized power in 1968, Saddam emerged as a key figure in the new regime. Though officially vice president under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, it was soon clear who held the reins. Saddam consolidated power quietly, appointing loyalists, purging rivals, controlling the intelligence services. He mastered the art of visibility and invisibility, always present in portraits, speeches, and parades, yet unseen in how decisions were made. By 1979, he formally took the presidency. And from that point on, Iraq was his stage. He spoke with the gravity of an ancient king. He invoked Nebuchadnezzar, Saladin, the glories of old. He saw himself not only as ruler, but as history's continuation, Iraq's savior, guardian, and embodiment. His rule began with blood. In a televised meeting of the Ba'ath Party, he read out a list of supposed traitors. As each name was called, men were dragged from the room. Some wept, some pleaded, others sat frozen. Many were executed. It was a performance not for those in the room, but for the entire country. The message was simple. Loyalty must be absolute. Dissent would be erased. Saddam built a surveillance state like few others in the region. Informants filled every corner, in offices, universities, even families. Fear became the language of safety. And silence, the only protest. But alongside terror, Saddam cultivated spectacle. He poured oil wealth into massive public projects. Baghdad saw new roads, hospitals, and grand avenues. He commissioned giant statues, triumphal arches, and gilded mosques, many adorned with his likeness or inscribed with his name. He built dozens of palaces, from desert fortresses to riverfront compounds. One stood atop ancient Babylon's ruins, a modern castle above history's bones. Inside, crystal chandeliers lit marble halls. Outside, gardens bloomed while nearby towns dried under sanctions and neglect. He styled himself as a military genius, often photographed in uniform, rifle in hand. But it was a war, not a victory, that came to define him. In 1980, Saddam invaded Iran, hoping to seize territory and assert dominance while the neighboring country reeled from revolution. What he expected to last weeks became an 8-year war. The Iran-Iraq War claimed over 1 million lives. Trenches stretched for miles. Poison gas was used. Cities were flattened. And neither side truly won. Iraq emerged battered and heavily in debt. To distract from the devastation, Saddam doubled down on nationalist pride. He framed the war as a glorious defense of Arab civilization. He had murals painted, songs composed, and even minted medals. But the wounds ran deep. By the late 1980s, his paranoia intensified. In 1988, he ordered the Anfal campaign against the Kurds in northern Iraq, a brutal operation of village destruction, forced displacement, and chemical attacks. One town, Halabja, was gassed. Thousands of civilians died, men, women, children. The images shocked the world. Families curled together in the street, frozen by cyanide and mustard gas. International condemnation followed. But consequences were limited, and Saddam remained unmoved. In 1990, with the economy crumbling and debts rising, he invaded Kuwait, claiming it was historically part of Iraq. The world responded swiftly. A US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm in airstrikes lit the night skies of Baghdad. Iraqi forces were pushed back. The war lasted weeks, the humiliation much longer. Though the regime survived, Iraq was placed under severe sanctions. Imports slowed. Medicine dwindled. Children grew sick. Infrastructure crumbled. Saddam, however, remained insulated in his palaces. He blamed the West, the Zionists, the imperialists, never himself. His speeches grew more defiant, his image more mythic. He held referendums claiming 100% approval. He published novels, under pseudonyms, filled with allegory and heroism. He had mosques built with calligraphy made from his own blood. And all the while, his people suffered. By the late 1990s, Saddam was a man of contradictions. He was feared, but not revered. Grand, but increasingly isolated. Photographed often, but rarely seen in person. International inspectors searched for weapons of mass destruction. Saddam played a game of cat and mouse, delaying, denying, defying. Then came 200. The United States, claiming proof of WMDs and links to terrorism, launched an invasion. Baghdad fell within weeks. Statues of Saddam were toppled. His palaces were looted. But Saddam vanished. For months, he hid in safe houses, bunkers, and village homes, his power reduced to whispers. Then, in December 2003, he was found near Tikrit, hiding in a small underground hole, bearded, disheveled, tired. The man who once ruled through spectacle was captured in silence. He stood trial before an Iraqi court for crimes against humanity, including the massacre of Dujail villagers in 19. He was found guilty, and in 2006, he was executed by hanging. The images of his final moments circulated worldwide, grainy, dark, unceremonious. The era had ended. Today, the palaces remain. Some are used by the Iraqi government. Others lie empty, echoing halls, bullet-pocked walls, crumbling tiles. The people of Iraq live with the legacy of his rule. Some still speak of order under Saddam. Others carry wounds from his prisons, his wars, his purges. The country he shaped has changed, but not yet healed. And the desert, always watching, folds his memory into its dust. Tonight, as the winds drift across the Tigris and the moonlight touches the ruins of Babylon, let the echoes grow quiet. Let the palaces, once filled with mirrors and fear, sleep empty. Let the people, once silenced, speak, and let the land, long scarred by ambition, breathe again. The mountains of northern Spain rise gently under a slate sky, their ridges lined with pine and silence. Here, far from the cities and crowds, wind carries not just cold air, but memory. A memory shaped by war, hushed by decree, and carried like stone in the hearts of generations. For nearly 4 decades, one man ruled Spain with a grip that did not scream but suppressed. His name was Francisco Franco, and his reign was not marked by noise, but by quiet. Franco was born in 1892 in the coastal city of Ferrol, Galicia. His family had long naval traditions, and though his father was distant and disapproving, the young Francisco gravitated toward military life. Reserved and meticulous, he entered a military academy and became one of the youngest generals in Europe by his early 30s. His rise was shaped by violence early on. In North Africa, he fought in Morocco during the Rif War, earning fame for discipline and ruthlessness. He viewed war as methodical, not emotional, a matter of order, not bloodlust. And in the army he found both his purpose and his place. Spain during these years was not at peace. Monarchs rose and fell. Republics formed and fractured. Tensions between conservatives, liberals, communists, and anarchists simmered. Land reform, labor unrest, and ideological struggle tore at the seams of a fragile republic. By 1936, the country sat on the edge of a blade. Franco, stationed in the Canary Islands, received word of a military coup. It was launched by generals who saw the Second Spanish Republic as chaotic, leftist, and dangerously secular. Franco hesitated, then joined, bringing with him the Army of Africa, Spain's most battle-hardened troops. What followed was not a swift takeover, but a brutal and grinding civil war. Spain split in two. The nationalists, led by Franco and backed by Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, against the Republicans, supported by Soviet forces and international volunteers. The war lasted 3 years. It was not clean. It was not noble. It was a war of cities shelled, villages burned, prisoners shot. Franco's forces bombed Guernica, a Basque town, in 1937, an act immortalized in Picasso's haunting painting. The image remains iconic: chaos, pain, collapse. By 1939, the Republicans had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands fled into exile. Thousands more were executed or imprisoned. Franco emerged victorious, not just as a general, but as a head of state. He did not take the title of king. He did not crown himself emperor. Instead, he became El Caudillo, the leader, a title soft in sound, but absolute in power. Franco began to shape Spain in his image. The monarchy was abolished, political parties banned, trade unions dissolved, press censored, education tightly controlled. Spain became a one-party state, with the Falange, a fascist-style movement, as its ideological arm. He upheld Catholicism as the moral pillar of the nation. He promoted conservative values, national unity, and Spanish identity. Regional languages like Catalan, Basque, and Galician were banned in schools and public life. Minority identities were smothered beneath slogans of Spain, one great and free. But freedom had little meaning in Franco's Spain. From 1939 into the 1950s, repression continued. Thousands were executed in the early post-war years. Others were sent to labor camps, blacklisted from jobs, or forced into silence. Homes whispered. Books vanished. Generations grew up learning to lower their voices. He built the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, a massive stone monument near Madrid, a basilica carved into a mountain, a towering cross above. He said it honored all those lost in the Civil War. But the truth was more complicated. It was constructed by political prisoners, those who had fought against him, and within its crypts were buried thousands, often without consent, from both sides. Franco himself would one day be buried there too. Spain, isolated under his rule, became a quiet, austere place. Autarky, economic self-sufficiency, kept goods scarce and progress slow. The 1940s were called the years of hunger. Ration cards, food lines, and smuggled goods defined daily life. Franco survived World War II by remaining neutral, though his sympathies leaned toward the Axis. After the war, he was shunned by the international community. But the Cold War changed things. As tensions rose between the US and the Soviet Union, Franco was seen as a useful anti-communist ally. In the 1950s, the US established military bases in Spain. Economic aid began flowing. Spain, slowly, began to open. By the 1960s, the regime softened slightly. Not in its core, but in its presentation. Tourism increased. Foreign investment grew. Highways, hotels, and industry appeared. But beneath the economic miracle was the same political rigidity. Opposition was not tolerated. Student protests were crushed. Strikes were banned. The press remained filtered. Spain, to much of the world, seemed modern, but lived in a quiet cage. Franco grew older, but not gentler. He ruled well into his 80s. When asked what would happen after his death, he smiled and replied, "Everything is tied up. It's all fixed." And in his mind, it was. In 1969, he named Prince Juan Carlos, grandson of the former king, as his successor, bypassing others, ensuring continuity. But he misread the future. On November 20, 1975, Francisco Franco died. His death did not spark revolution. It sparked something quieter. A transition. Juan Carlos, once thought to be Franco's heir in ideology, began steering Spain toward democracy. He legalized political parties, called elections, restored freedoms, and most importantly, earned the trust of a wary people. By the 1980s, Spain had rejoined the modern world as a parliamentary democracy. But the past could not be erased. For decades, Franco's legacy was met with a kind of pact of silence. His crimes were seldom discussed. His name rarely debated. It was as if Spain, after so long in silence, feared its own voice. But time has softened that fear. In recent years, debates over Franco's legacy have returned. Monuments have been removed. Street names changed. And in 2019, Franco's remains were exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen and reburied in a quieter grave, away from the monument he built to himself. His image, once in every plaza, has faded. His name, once feared, now belongs to books, not walls. And the Spain of today, vibrant, plural, democratic, is no longer his. Still, the silence he imposed lingers in stories untold, in the generation who learned not to speak, in the families divided by a war, never fully mourned. Tonight, let the hills of Galicia breathe without footsteps. Let the classrooms echo with all Spain's voices, Catalan, Basque, Galician, Castilian. Let the bells ring not for leaders, but for lives. The long silence has ended, but its lesson remains. That freedom is not noise, but the right to speak without fear.